The Gulf Coast can be a place of wonder where the sunrise glitters on calm waters and families rely on generations-old fishing traditions to get by. For Mateo Barrera, a hardworking single father, those waters have always meant freedom and a modest livelihood. In recent months, though, an undercurrent of fear has seeped into the brine-scented docks. A gang calling themselves the Bay Dogs has begun extorting local fishermen, threatening everyone who calls these shores home. They have no idea they're about to pick a fight with the wrong family. Mateo's niece, 14-year-old Celia, is the joy of his life, a bright girl growing up too fast in a world that seems more dangerous by the day. But hidden behind Mateo's quiet resolve is a secret no one at the port expects. He has a brother, James Barrera, who walked away from a life of combat missions as a Marine raider. He's a man shaped by war, harboring dark memories and lethal skills. And when this ruthless gang crosses the line by targeting Celia, James will return to a place he once fled, ready to do whatever it takes to save the only family he has left. Little do the Bay Dogs know that with a single act of aggression, they've awakened an unstoppable force. What begins as an ordinary day at the docks will soon explode into a cat-and-mouse battle across the Gulf Coast, unleashing vengeance, exposing corruption, and changing a small seaside community forever. Chapter 1. The Scent of Low Tide. Mateo Barrera squinted against the sun's glare as he slid his fishing boat into the slip at the ramshackle marina. The waters of this particular Gulf Coast inlet were brackish and still, breathing out a rotten egg stench whenever the tide dropped in the midday heat. He had been out before dawn, coaxing meager catches from the murky bay, speckled trout, flounder, and the occasional red drum. It was a precarious living, but it was his living. Next to him, nestled in life jackets and a tangle of rods and nets, sat his daughter, 14-year-old Celia. She had insisted on coming with him. She loved the old fiberglass boat and the sense of freedom out on the open water. He loved having her there. Her mother had died when Celia was just a baby, and ever since, father and daughter had clung to each other like anchors in a storm. But storms, by their very nature, come unexpectedly. And the tides in that particular harbor had been turning for a while now. It was as if the water itself sensed the tension in the air. Mateo docked with precision, though his arms ached from hauling in the nets. Celia hopped onto the small wooden pier, nimble and sure-footed. She wore a broad, bright grin, the sort of smile that hadn't yet been stolen by the harsh realities of life. She was always the one who brought him hope. Her father took the time to pat her on the shoulder. "Go on. Take the tackle box to the shed. I'll handle the fish." The wire basket squirmed with the last catches, and Mateo sighed, guessing they would only fetch a small sum at the local fish market. Still, every bit helped when the bills rolled in. As Celia carted the tackle box away, Mateo studied the horizon. The Gulf shimmered under the afternoon sun, beautiful in its surface tranquility. Yet he knew, like so many other locals, that beneath that veneer lurked a tangle of trouble. For months now, rumors of a dockside gang had circulated. Men in battered trucks with tinted windows drifted through the harbors, demanding fees from local fishermen, often accompanied by subtle or not-so-subtle threats. Some had their boats mysteriously vandalized if they refused to pay. Others spoke of break-ins at night, stolen equipment, or stolen catches. Few people named the gang openly, because a name would give them the power of recognition. But their presence was undeniable. Mateo had always shrugged it off, refusing to let fear drive him from his only livelihood. He told himself that if you kept your head low, you could sail under their radar. He focused on his fatherly duty, raise Celia right. Yet the tension around the docks had grown too thick to ignore. 2 fishermen had refused to cough up the dock fee last week. They came back the next morning to find their boats scuttled, riddled with holes. The sheriff's department was underfunded and seemed to have little motivation to investigate thoroughly. Rumor had it that half the local deputies were on the gang's payroll. It left men like Mateo feeling alone and vulnerable. As he tied up the last lines, he heard footsteps behind him, 2 sets. Slowly, He turned, bracing himself for what he suspected. Before him stood two men in short-sleeve button-up shirts, open at the collar to reveal cheap gold chains. They had the air of predators. One was wiry with a pockmarked face, and the other was stocky with a poorly done anchor tattoo on his forearm. Mateo had seen them slinking around the harbor before. They seemed to fancy themselves enforcers for this rumored gang. "Afternoon," Mateo said carefully. He didn't ask them what they wanted. That would be giving them the first move. Instead, he wiped the brine off his hands onto his worn jeans. Waiting. Pockmarked face smirked. "That's a good catch you got, Fisherman. Looks like you might turn a tidy profit." He gestured dismissively at the wire basket of fish. Mateo mustered a polite nod but said nothing. The stocky one narrowed his eyes. "We heard you've been out here for a while now. And, well, there are new rules these days." He spat on the dock. "There's a fee to unload here. Let's call it a protection cost so folks like you can work in peace." Mateo felt anger coil in his gut but pressed it down. He had no illusions about being able to handle two strong, potentially armed men. Nor did he want a fight that could put Celia in danger. Still, he didn't have extra money to spare. "That's funny," he managed in a steady tone. "I've been unloading at this dock for nearly 20 years. Nobody's ever asked me for a fee." Pockmarked face clicked his tongue. "Times change. You pay us or you find yourself out of luck tomorrow. Maybe your boat will sink in the night, or maybe you'll be sleeping on the wharf. Up to you." He gave a small shrug, an imitation of casual indifference that came off menacing. Clenching his teeth, Mateo pulled a wallet from his back pocket. Inside was a meager wad of bills, money for groceries and gas. It was all he had until he sold the day's catch. Every fiber in him rebelled against surrendering it. But then he thought about Celia, her bright eyes, the future she deserved. He couldn't risk confrontation in front of her. Reluctantly, he peeled off a single $5 bill, hoping it might suffice. "This is all I can spare," he lied. Stocky's face twisted in disgust. "That's nowhere near the share we expect. I don't think you're hearing us properly. You gotta pay your dues if you want to keep fishing in these parts." Before the situation escalated further, Celia reappeared, the empty tackle box in hand, oblivious. "Papa, where do you want?" She froze, eyes darting between the men. A flash of something dark and predatory passed through Stocky's gaze, but he forced a grin. "Never mind, sweetie. Your dad's just having a chat." He stared far too long at her, as though memorizing her features. Mateo felt his stomach knot. He stepped between them protectively. "Next time," he said, "I'll have your fee. Let's leave it at that for today." The two men exchanged a glance. They had apparently decided to let him off with a warning. "We'll be watching," Pockmarked Face said, voice low. Then they turned and stalked away. The moment they were gone, Celia rushed to her father's side. "Papa," she whispered, "who were those men?" He exhaled and willed the tension out of his shoulders. "No one you need to worry about," he said, forcing confidence he didn't feel. "Just some new rules around the marina. Let's get the fish to market, then head home." They walked together in silence, father and daughter, pushing a creaking cart laden with a small day's catch. From time to time, Celia would glance over her shoulder, as if she could still sense the men's eyes on her. When they left the marina, the sky overhead remained intensely blue, but there was no sense of freedom or comfort under that expanse. Mateo cursed under his breath. He hated that he had been forced to pay a bribe and that it might not even be enough to keep them safe tomorrow. He regretted showing any sign of weakness in front of Celia, but it was the reflection of rage in her eyes that he found most unsettling. She was young, yes, but he had rarely seen such fury gather in her features. She was growing up in a world that no longer respected honest work, a world that preyed on the weak. Still, he wanted to protect her from that knowledge, to maintain her innocence just a little longer. Yet in his chest, a flicker of fear mingled with anger. He'd always done his best to be strong for Celia, but for the first time he found himself wishing that his brother, James Barrera, was around. James, the Marine raider who had served multiple tours in conflict zones around the globe, was rumored to have done things that defied belief. He'd gone off the grid after his discharge, battered by war and life. Mateo had not seen him in a couple of years, but he might be the only man who could stand toe-to-toe with scum like these gang enforcers and make them regret ever setting foot on the Barrera dock. Mateo shook the thought away. He had no clue where James even was, probably drifting somewhere between regret and solitude. The only evidence that James was still alive were the postcards that arrived sporadically, always unsigned, from remote corners of the world. The last one had arrived a year ago, showing a photo of a rundown dive bar on the outskirts of Manila. The scrawled words on the back read, "Sometimes I wish I could start over. J." No further explanation. Whatever regrets or heartbreak James carried, Mateo doubted his brother would return just because of a few threats in a Gulf Coast fishing town. And so, father and daughter trudged onward alone, unaware that the threat looming over them was far greater than a petty demand for money. That night would pass quietly, but the darkness that gathered would make them wish they had an avenging angel at their side. Their problems had only just begun. Chapter 2. Riptides and Rumors. The next day dawned with more of the same. Mateo avoided the marina altogether, choosing a different stretch of beach further east, though it meant a longer drive and hauling the small boat in a rusty trailer behind his worn-out pickup. He hoped he might dodge the gang's roving eyes. The roiling stress in his gut made the morning coffee taste bitter. Celia, usually so enthusiastic, had grown reticent, her thoughts clearly stuck on yesterday's encounter. She helped him set up the boat in moody silence. Finally, Mateo tried to inject levity. "We'll catch a record-setting flounder today," he said, patting her shoulder. She forced a half-smile, then continued adjusting the lines. Despite a quiet start, the trip out to open water proved fruitful. They found a decent spot near the mouth of a river inlet, and by midday, they had netted a respectable catch of trout and a few fat blue crabs to boot. The tension lifted from father and daughter, replaced by a sense of cautious optimism. Maybe it was still possible to make a living away from the eyes of those dockside bullies. But as they headed back, tension returned. Rounding a bend in the meandering river channel that led to the open Gulf, Mateo noticed a weathered aluminum boat drifting ahead. Two men were inside, scanning the shoreline. The boat didn't bear any official markings of the Coast Guard or wildlife officers. The men's posture screamed suspicion, and they kept an eye on every passing craft. When they saw Mateo and Celia, they angled closer, motors humming. Celia tensed, gripping the side of their boat. She leaned close to her father. "Papa, is that?" He swallowed. "Stay calm." He doubted these men would attack them in broad daylight on a busy channel, but fear still gnawed at him. Both he and Celia feigned neutrality as they passed, acknowledging the men with the barest nod. One of them stared for a few seconds, then gave a single nod back, as if to say, "We know who you are." They turned their boat the other way. Still, the message was clear. The gang's presence wasn't confined to a single marina. They were watching the entire coastline. Mateo exhaled shakily when the men disappeared around a bend. Celia said nothing, but her eyes glowed with determination. She hated feeling hunted, and so did he. Still, what could they do? By late afternoon, they drove home, hearts heavy once again. Their home was a small, single-story structure near a stretch of coastal wetlands. The paint flaked in places, and the yard was bare except for patches of stubborn weeds. Yet it was cozy inside, with mementos of Celia's childhood, plus pictures of her late mother, Maria, and other family members, including the elusive Uncle James. Mateo tried to greet his daughter with warmth, but she remained lost in thought. "I'm going to clean the nets," Celia finally said. She trudged outside with a stiff brush. Usually, she'd tune into her favorite music or hum under her breath, but now she did the chore in silence. Anxiety weighed on them like a wet blanket, and try as he might, Mateo couldn't chase it away. He turned on the local news, half listening to idle chatter about a new shipment of cargo at the docks. Then came a brief segment on an incident of suspicious activity near the marina, with mention of vandalized boats. The anchor gave a perfunctory mention of authorities investigating before moving on. Mateo ran his hand over his face. The pit in his stomach deepened. He was standing there, mind swirling with negative thoughts, when the doorbell rang. His pulse spiked. Was it the gang? He peered cautiously out the window and relaxed a bit. The man on his porch wore a worn work shirt and carried a cardboard box. It was Benito, a friend from the local fish market. Mateo opened the door a crack, and Benito gave him a sober smile. "Hey, compadre, can I come in?" "Sure," Mateo said. He stepped aside, letting the older man in. Benito set the box on the small kitchen table. It clanked with glass jars. "Took me a while to gather," Benito said. "Some neighbors chipped in. This homemade salsa, rice, beans, just a few basics. We're all feeling it, man." His voice was heavy. He explained that the same gang had shaken down multiple fishermen in the last 2 weeks, and some had refused to go out on the water at all. It was affecting the supply at the fish market, and in turn, Benito's own income. Everyone was suffering under the gang's extortion racket. The local shrimpers and crabbers were starting to talk about organizing, but they were afraid of retribution. Mateo nodded. "I appreciate this." He glanced at the floor, shame mixing with gratitude. "We're getting by, but these new fees aren't making it easy." Benito rubbed his chin. "I heard they've got some big boss calling the shots. People say he's from upstate, runs a chain of rackets across multiple ports, from here to Louisiana. Rumor is he's got political connections. The gang calls itself the Bay Dogs. They claim any coastal territory as their turf, demanding protection money from marinas, charter captains, even local restaurants. It's bad news." Mateo clenched his fists. "This used to be a decent place to live. This used to be," Benito agreed. "Now we gotta watch ourselves. Don't try anything alone." His eyes flicked to the living room window, as if checking for watchers. "If we stick together as a community, maybe we can push them out. But it won't be easy." Before leaving, Benito passed Mateo a slip of paper. "A few guys are meeting at the old cannery warehouse next week. Maybe talk about forming a co-op, see if we can get outside help. Could be a risk, though. The Bay Dogs might have informants. Just think about it." After Benito was gone, the house felt even more silent. Mateo gazed at the slip of paper, imagining a clandestine meeting in a derelict warehouse. The idea of banding together appealed to him, but he also pictured the violent repercussions if the gang found out. Though the community needed to do something, how many families would be sacrificed along the way? Outside, Celia was finishing up with the nets. Mateo joined her. She peered at him. Was that someone from the market? Her voice was quieter than usual. He nodded, telling her about Benito's generosity and the talk of a meeting. Her eyes flickered with a spark. "Then you should go. If everyone's tired of being bullied, maybe there's a chance to fight back." Mateo recognized the passion in her voice, the strong will that reminded him of her mother. "We'll see," he hedged. "It could be dangerous." Celia's gaze turned resolute. "Let me come with you." He almost laughed, though there was no real humor in his tone. "You're only 14. This is grown-up business." She glared. "And the kidnapping and extortion these creeps are doing is grown-up business too. But it affects us. Do you really think they'll spare me because I'm a kid? Mateo sighed. She had a point. Innocence offered no immunity anymore. I'll think about it, he said quietly, rubbing the back of his neck. Let's not talk more about it until we know the details. They finished stowing the nets. The sun dipped low, painting the water in oranges and pinks. On any other evening, it would have been a glorious sight. Yet father and daughter felt only a tightening apprehension. A deep riptide of unrest was forming beneath the surface of their coastal life, and they could sense it wouldn't be long before it pulled them all under. That night, Celia tried to do her homework at the rickety dining table. She stared at textbooks, but her mind was elsewhere. Mateo hovered behind her, not sure how to ease her worry. She had always been so vibrant, an avid reader and budding artist. Now the tension stole her focus. Eventually, she gave up and went to bed early. Mateo sat alone in the living room. A battered picture frame on the mantel caught his eye. James Barrera, younger and grinning in his Marine Raider uniform. Their mother had once referred to James as the unstoppable one, while describing Mateo as the steady one. They had been thick as thieves growing up, until James left to chase military glory. What changed him, though? He came back with scars on his body and deeper scars in his mind. Still, there had been times when James proved unstoppable indeed. If only. Mateo shook his head. Wishful thinking about James's return wouldn't solve anything. The next best thing was this meeting at the cannery. Perhaps a group of determined citizens could stand up to these bay dogs. But he knew it wouldn't be so simple. The gang had money, guns, and a willingness to do whatever it took to maintain control. Could the local fishermen and small business owners muster the same resolve? A wave of exhaustion crashed over him. He turned out the lights and double-checked the locks. Then he paused at Celia's bedroom door, listening to her slow, steady breathing. She was so young, her life just beginning. He wondered if he could protect her from the storm that was barreling their way. He finally dragged himself into his own room, where he collapsed onto the bed. Just as sleep began tugging at his consciousness, he imagined hearing the roar of an engine outside, a harsh, thrumming noise. He bolted upright and glanced at the window. Nothing. Probably the neighbors or just his tired mind playing tricks. Still, it took him a while to drift off, uneasy at the thought that sooner or later, the gang would come calling again. There was no running from them, not on this coastline or any other. Little did he know, danger was creeping closer. And soon, everything he cherished would be in the crosshairs. Chapter 3. Strangers on the Docks. Despite his intent to avoid the main marina, Mateo realized he couldn't evade it forever. The following week, after uneasy deliberation, he decided to sell his catch there because the small roadside fish stand he'd been using couldn't handle larger orders. The manager at the main marina fish market, Margaret, had offered a better price if he was brave enough to show up. Mateo needed every penny, so he swallowed his fears and drove out there. It was early morning, the sky still tinted with dawn's pale glow. He hoped the hour might mean fewer enforcers hanging around. Celia had insisted on coming, partly out of her strong-willed nature and partly because she felt safer sticking close. She also wanted to see if the rumors of intimidation were true firsthand. Pulling into the marina parking lot, they found it more crowded than expected. Fishing boats lined the slips, some unloading huge nets of shrimp. Tractor trailers idled nearby, waiting to haul cargo. Men hurried with hoses, forklift crates, and pallets of ice. The salty tang of brine and diesel fumes filled the air. From a distance, it almost looked like a thriving commercial enterprise, the sort you'd see in a prosperous coastal town. But a closer look revealed the tension in people's shoulders, the furtive glances, and the hush that fell whenever certain unfamiliar faces appeared. "All right," Mateo murmured to Celia. "Stay close." He helped her out of the truck. Then they moved to the boat, which was towed behind. He popped open the cooler, revealing a modest but decent catch of snapper and a few large trout. Celia assisted with the gear, scanning the parking lot warily. Several men in dark windbreakers stood off to the side, arms crossed, as if they owned the place. People gave them a wide berth. Celia leaned close to her father. "Who are they?" "The bay dogs, or at least their muscle," Mateo muttered. "Don't stare, or they'll take it as a challenge." He half expected them to swagger over and demand a payoff. But this morning they seemed otherwise occupied, conferring with some fresh arrivals who wore even nicer clothes. A woman in a business blazer, flanked by two men in crisp slacks. They appeared to be touring the marina, taking notes. It was an odd sight. The woman's sharp gaze flicked over everything, including Mateo and Celia, but she showed no particular reaction. Perhaps these were higher-ups in the gang, or maybe city officials in the gang's pocket. Either way, it made his stomach churn. Ignoring the watchers as best he could, Mateo navigated the labyrinth of crates and hoses to Margaret's spot in the fish market. She was a stout woman with tired eyes, but she greeted him kindly. "Glad to see you, Mateo," she said, eyeing Celia with a grin. "Need a hand unloading?" They began transferring fish onto a scale. Margaret quickly recorded the weight in a logbook. Then she paid Mateo in cash, counting out bills with meticulous care. It was more money than he'd seen in weeks, enough to stock groceries for a while and maybe fix the leaky roof. He exhaled a wave of relief, though it was tinged with dread. There would be eyes on that money shark circling. Sure enough, the men in windbreakers took note. One of them pulled out a phone, made a call, and continued glancing their way. Celia pretended not to see, focusing instead on coiling ropes. After a few minutes, Margaret whispered, "Look, I don't want trouble, but I can't stop them if they come to collect. Be careful." Mateo gave her a strained nod. Just as he pocketed the cash, the woman in the blazer approached. She had a confident stride that suggested she was the one in control, not the men around her. Her hair was pinned back tightly, and her expression was coolly polite. "Good morning," she said, scanning Mateo's face. Her voice held a faint accent, maybe northeastern or out of state. "I'm told you're one of our local fishermen. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" Mateo exchanged a quick glance with Celia. "Ma'am," he replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Name's Helena Pierce," she said, offering a handshake that felt more like a challenge than a greeting. "I'm representing a consortium of investors interested in the development of this port. We want to make sure operations here run smoothly, and that local fishermen like yourself aren't interfering with progress." Mateo frowned. "I'm just trying to make a living, ma'am." "Of course." She gave a tight smile. "Perhaps you've heard about new fees for unloading catches. I'd hate for there to be any misunderstandings. This region's economy thrives on cooperation. People who understand that can be compensated well." It was all so cordial on the surface, but Celia tensed beside him, sensing the threat. Mateo didn't pretend ignorance. "I've heard rumors," he said quietly. Helena's gaze flickered toward Celia, then back to him. "That's good. Rumors can be dangerous, though, if they're twisted. Now, the local fishermen's community is in negotiations with a new business structure. You might have heard them called the Bay Dogs, but that's just a nickname. They're a management group, and I represent some of their higher-level interests. We aim to modernize the port, enforce certain regulations, and ensure we eliminate any friction from outliers who don't want to pay their fair share." Margaret blanched behind her. The conversation in the market hushed. Even the forklift operators slowed to watch, no one daring to interrupt. Mateo forced himself to speak. "These management fees are strangling us," he said. "We can't afford to pay more and more when we barely make ends meet." Pierce shrugged, her face impassive. "I understand your concerns, but progress has a cost. Should you choose not to cooperate, well, There are always consequences. She let that hang in the air before adding with a smile, "We want everyone to benefit. Those who comply could see expanded markets, investments, maybe even state-of-the-art equipment. Think carefully, Mr. Barrera. The new system is coming whether you like it or not." A cold flush seeped through Mateo. He realized now that these bay dogs were not just a band of local thugs. This operation was bigger, more organized, with the veneer of corporate legitimacy. One step away from laundering money, blackmailing local officials, and swallowing up small businesses that refused to comply. Celia spoke up suddenly, surprising them all. "Do these investors know how many families depend on this port? That people have been working these waters for generations?" Pierce's eyes narrowed. She studied Celia's defiant expression. For a second, a flicker of something, annoyance or curiosity, crossed her face. "Young lady, trust me. I'm well aware of this port's tradition, but the modern era requires modern solutions. Maybe it's time for some families to adapt or move on." Mateo subtly gripped Celia's shoulder, a signal to stay calm. He faced Pierce. "I'll think about what you've said." She dipped her head in a gesture reminiscent of a queen granting an audience. "Good. We'll be in touch." With that, she turned and strode away, her men flanking her. The other windbreaker-wearing goons melted back into the hustle of the marina, but the message was clear. They had eyes everywhere. Margaret exhaled, relief in her gaze. "Go, Mateo. Don't hang around. Take that money home." He needed no second urging. Collecting Celia, he returned to the truck. They drove off, hearts pounding. Only when they were well clear of the marina did they dare speak. "She's worse than the two who confronted us before," Celia said, voice trembling with anger. "She was so smug." Mateo nodded. "Yeah, she's the type who pulls strings from the top." He pictured Helena Pierce's cool, polished demeanor. She clearly had the resources to back up her threats. "We have to be careful." But even as they spoke, a terrible question weighed on Mateo's mind. How can we possibly fight this woman and her organization? The local fishermen alone, with their battered boats and meager funds, stood little chance. Back home, father and daughter unloaded the catch money and tried to calm their nerves. Over a lunch of leftover rice and beans, Mateo turned the slip of paper from Benito over and over in his hands. The meeting at the cannery was only a few days away. He had planned to go alone, but seeing Celia's fierce determination, he half suspected she might follow him anyway. In the afternoon, he took a short walk by the shoreline, scanning the horizon in search of answers that didn't exist. The wetlands smelled of salt and decay, as usual, but it felt comforting in its familiarity. This was home after all. He had grown up building forts in the marsh grass with James. His brother had taught him to fish with a bamboo pole. He and Maria had shared their first kiss under a moonlit sky on that very dock. Giving it all up now felt unthinkable. The problem was, if he stayed, the Bay Dogs wouldn't stop until they owned everything, including his livelihood. And their unscrupulous methods could soon lead to tragedy. He peered across the water and thought of James once more. "If only you were here, hermano." He returned to the house, finding Celia rummaging through a hall closet. She emerged triumphantly with a battered old lockbox. "Isn't this Uncle James's? The one he left with us?" Mateo blinked. "He left it behind years ago, yeah. He said it had some old letters and a few keepsakes." "Why?" Celia shrugged, a subtle glint in her eye. "I want to see if there's a way to contact him. An address, a clue, anything. Because we can't do this alone, Papa. And you know it." He hesitated, feeling the weight of that truth. "I don't know, Celia. Even if we found a hint, James might be halfway around the world by now. He's not the same man he used to be." She met his gaze. "But he's still family, and he's dangerous. Maybe that's exactly what we need." Mateo sighed. If he had any illusions about keeping Celia out of this conflict, they were gone. "All right," he murmured. "We'll look." He retrieved the key from the kitchen junk drawer, where it had lain for years. Together, they opened James's old lockbox. Inside, they found letters from old Marine buddies, a couple of pictures from James's deployments, and a small stack of postcards from places like Okinawa, Dubai, Morocco. Some of these postcards were ones James had collected while traveling, with short notes scribbled in his scrawling handwriting. No phone numbers, no addresses that looked current. There was also a battered dog tag with James's name and blood type, an artifact of the war he once fought. But one item stood out, a folded slip of paper with a phone number next to a single initial, J. It looked like James's handwriting. Curiously, the number had a U.S. area code. Could this be him? Celia asked, eyes bright. Mateo frowned, uncertain. It might be outdated or it might be something else entirely. But it was a lead. Let's see. With no landline in the house, they grabbed a cell phone. Heart pounding, Mateo dialed. The phone rang 4 times before a curt, automated message played. "This number is no longer in service. Please check." He hung up, frustration knotting his gut. Celia exhaled. Maybe we can track him down another way. Maybe we can ask around. He must have kept in touch with someone. Uncle James couldn't just vanish into thin air. Mateo gently closed the box. "Let's not get our hopes up. I'll try to get more info from some of the old folks in town who remember him. But no promises." His daughter's frustration was palpable. "We need him." Mateo didn't answer. He quietly carried the box back to his closet, placing it on a high shelf. A swirl of memories battered him. Childhood pranks, shared secrets, the day James had enlisted. How far had his brother sunk after the war? Would he even care enough to return to a place he once wanted to escape? Night settled. The 3rd day in a row ended with the tension of not knowing who might come knocking. The local law enforcement turned a blind eye. The gang was tightening its hold, and father and daughter found themselves dreaming of a long-lost brother who might or might not have the strength to help them. Outside, in the stillness of the coastal air, a single figure loitered behind a scraggly tree, watching the house. The silhouette vanished into the darkness, leaving no trace. None of them knew it yet, but the kidnapping that would shatter their world was drawing closer. The Bay Dogs never let defiance go unanswered. They would soon show the Barreras and the entire community what happened when you stood against them. Chapter 4. Shadows at the Cannery. The meeting at the old cannery warehouse was scheduled for a Thursday night. The decrepit building sat at the edge of town, a relic of an era when canning and shipping fish was a thriving industry on the Gulf Coast. Now, its windows were boarded, its roof sagging in places. A faint odor of rust and stale brine clung to the walls, as if they remembered the better days that once breathed life into this port. Mateo arrived half an hour early, leaving Celia behind despite her protests. He had told her to stay inside the house, doors locked. He sensed this was not an event for teenagers, even those as brave and determined as his daughter. He parked his truck in the shadows of an abandoned loading dock, scanning the darkness for watchers. A single overhead light flickered, casting an anemic glow across cracked concrete. Somewhere in the distance, wind rattled a piece of corrugated metal. He stepped inside, greeted by a small group of local fishermen and boat owners clustered around a few folding chairs. Benito waved him over. The older man, still wearing a stained apron from the fish market, offered a tense smile. "Glad you're here, compadre," he whispered. "We need every voice." They waited in uneasy silence until nearly 24 people had trickled in. A few were restaurant owners who relied on fresh catch. Others were dock workers who hated the new extortion policies. The atmosphere was fraught. Some people glanced over their shoulders as though expecting Helena Pierce's men to burst in at any moment. A single halogen lamp dangling from the rafters cast ghostly shadows on the ground. Finally, a tall, wiry fisherman named Dallas stepped forward. He had spent decades working shrimp boats further up the coast, near the Louisiana border, and wore the deeply tanned face of someone who'd spent half his life on the water. "Friends," he began, voice echoing through the building. "We all know why we're here. The Bay Dogs, and the people behind them, have been choking us with fees, threats, and violence. Our livelihoods are on the line. I heard rumors they're pushing to modernize this entire coastline, driving out anyone who can't pay or won't cooperate." A rumble of discontent spread through the crowd. A man in a straw hat muttered something about crooked local officials. A petite woman with bright eyes, Marisol, a crabber, spoke next. "They smashed my crab pots last week when I didn't pay. 40 pots, destroyed. I'm barely hanging on. We have to take a stand before they ruin everyone." "Or worse," muttered Benito. "They aren't shy about hurting people who resist." Several heads nodded. The group began brainstorming ways to fight back. Boycotts, petitions, maybe appealing to out-of-county law enforcement. But the conversation grew tense as soon as someone mentioned organizing patrols. Another man objected that such an action would only invite violent retaliation. Anger and fear mixed in equal measure. As the debate rattled on, Mateo listened quietly. He was no stranger to hardship, but the sheer power of the Bay Dogs and Helena Pierce felt crushing. He forced himself to speak up. "I've seen their leader at the docks," he said. "She's well-funded, has political ties. They're not just local thugs. They're bigger, more organized. If we unite, we have to be prepared for a real battle. Because once we draw their attention in a bold way, there's no going back." The gathered men and women fell silent. That was the heart of it. Committing to resistance meant risking it all. Did they have enough unity or desperation to do it? Before anyone could respond, the warehouse door suddenly creaked open. Everyone tensed. A single figure slipped inside, a young man in a rumpled plaid shirt, his eyes darting around anxiously. "Sorry," he stammered. "Didn't mean to spook you. Name's Trent. I'm new here." No one recognized him. A wary hush fell. Dallas cleared his throat. "You sure you're in the right place, friend?" Trent bobbed his head. "Benito told me about the meeting, said I should come if I wanted to help. I work part-time on a shrimp trawler." Benito blinked, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I told a couple folks. Sorry, I didn't realize you'd show." Reluctantly, the group allowed Trent to join. Conversation resumed, now laced with a subtle undertone of suspicion. Had they compromised themselves by letting a stranger in? Some people shot Trent dubious glances. For his part, the young man hovered on the fringes, nodding without contributing much. It wasn't obvious that he was an informant. He seemed far too nervous. Still, the tension didn't ease. Finally, Dallas tried to corral everyone's ideas into a plan. "First, we need a legal angle if we can get the state police or maybe the FBI involved. Second, we might need community watch squads. We can't let them sabotage our boats without pushback. And if they come around demanding money, we film them or record them for evidence." A bearded fisherman snorted. "The sheriff's in their pocket. Even if we had footage, who would we take it to?" Others chimed in about how the Bay Dogs might retaliate by hurting families. The mood grew grim. Benito cleared his throat. "Look, I'm no fool, but we can't just accept this. Maybe we can reach out beyond the county. There's got to be a bigger net of law enforcement somewhere. Unless..." He trailed off, glancing at Mateo. "Unless you've got family who might help." Mateo stiffened. "My brother's a former Marine raider. We haven't spoken in years. I don't even know if he's in the country." He hesitated, feeling eyes turned toward him. "Even if he were around, I'm not sure one man could fix this." Benito pursed his lips. Sometimes one man can change the course of a fight if he's trained for war. An uneasy hush followed. Mateo felt conflicting emotions roil inside him. James was a wild card, a man with a dark past. But a flicker of hope kindled at the thought that maybe, just maybe, if push came to shove, his brother could be the tipping point. Mateo said nothing, though. He simply exhaled. Dallas stepped back into the middle. "We need to gather concrete evidence of extortion," he concluded. "Without proof, we're just shouting into the wind. Let's each vow to keep records of what they demand and how often. We'll meet again in a week to compare notes and see if we can find any outside agency willing to help." People murmured reluctant agreement. They began filtering out, still uneasy about whether this was enough. Mateo turned to go as well. Outside, he found the night had grown darker, the wind sharper. As he walked toward his truck, footsteps echoed behind him. He spun, pulse spiking, but it was only Trent, the newcomer. Up close, Mateo noted how young he looked, maybe early 20s, with a gaunt face that suggested poor nourishment or constant stress. "Hey," Trent began, voice low. "Thanks for letting me join. I just wanted to say I don't want trouble, but I can't afford these fees. My mom's sick, and I need every cent." Mateo's wariness softened a degree. "It's okay. We're all in the same boat." He studied Trent's anxious eyes. "Just be careful. If we move against the Bay Dogs, they'll want to punish us." Trent nodded, swallowing hard. "I will. Good night, sir." He headed off toward a battered sedan parked under a flickering streetlight. Left alone, Mateo peered at the looming silhouette of the cannery, half expecting someone to watch from a broken window. A rustle of movement near a fence made him stiffen, but it was just a stray cat slinking off. He forced himself to breathe normally, then climbed into his truck and started the engine. As he drove home, he mulled over everything he'd heard. It was a plan, albeit a fragile one. They'd gather evidence and hope that some higher authority might step in. But in his heart, he had grave doubts. Helena Pierce and the Bay Dogs would not stand idly by while locals built a case against them. She had resources, money, and the willingness to crush dissent. The question wasn't whether they would retaliate. It was when, pulling into his driveway, Mateo spotted Celia's silhouette at the window, waiting anxiously. He felt a pang of guilt for leaving her alone, yet he knew she needed to be kept out of direct danger. As he stepped inside, she rushed forward. "How did it go?" He forced a half-smile. "We talked, made plans to collect evidence. Nothing too dramatic." His tone belied his anxious heartbeat. Celia saw the shadow in his eyes. "They're going to fight back, aren't they?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, we have no choice." Together, father and daughter locked up the house for the night, both aware that the storm on the horizon was rolling in fast. Outside, the wind carried the distant sound of waves crashing on the shore, an incessant reminder that nature was indifferent to human struggles. Whether the fishermen banded together or not, the tide would continue to rise. And soon, it would bring the Bay Dogs' wrath with it, plunging the Barrera family into a darkness they could scarcely imagine. Chapter 5. Gloves come off. The next morning, Mateo decided to avoid the marina again. Instead, he tried another less frequented boat launch near an old coastal highway. Celia insisted on going along. After the cannery meeting, she refused to remain idle, an undercurrent of defiance burning within her. Though it worried him, Mateo also felt proud of her grit. They spent the early hours fishing in silence. The Gulf waters sparkled under the rising sun, deceptively serene. By noon, the tide lulled, and they had a modest haul. Celia busied herself adjusting lines when Mateo spotted a strange vehicle on the narrow coastal road that overlooked the water. A black SUV with tinted windows idled there, facing the boat launch. Even from a distance, he sensed it was trouble. "Celia," he said, voice tight. She followed his gaze, and her face darkened with apprehension. "Could be them," she whispered. Mateo gave her a quick nod. "We'll unload fast and leave." He steered the boat toward the makeshift ramp. They worked together, hauling gear and fish into the rusted truck. The black SUV remained in place, engines softly rumbling. Just as they finished, a second vehicle, a battered sedan, appeared on the road, pulled up beside the SUV. For a moment, Mateo's heart clenched. Was this an ambush? But then the sedan's door opened, and a familiar figure emerged. Trent, the newcomer from last night's meeting. He approached the SUV driver's window, leaning in to speak. The scene played out too far away for Mateo to hear their words, but he felt immediate alarm. Celia frowned. "Is that the guy from the cannery? What's he doing with them?" Mateo's pulse spiked with suspicion. Maybe Trent was being forced into this confrontation. Or maybe he wasn't. The conversation between Trent and the person in the SUV was brief. Trent handed something over, an envelope possibly. A moment later, the SUV peeled away, heading back toward town at speed. In a daze, Mateo watched Trent linger by his car. The younger man's posture was tense, head bowed as though caught in guilt. He then noticed Mateo and Celia at the launch. Their gazes locked across the 100-yard distance. Trent's face paled. He scrambled into his sedan and took off, clouds of dust swirling behind him. Celia turned to her father, eyes wide. "Papa, do you think he's an informant?" Mateo felt a bitter taste in his mouth. "I don't know," he muttered, but the pit in his stomach grew. Had the Bay Dogs planted Trent to gather intelligence? Or maybe they'd coerced him. Either way, it spelled danger for everyone who attended the cannery meeting. "Let's get home," he said, climbing into the driver's seat. The truck's engine coughed to life, and they rumbled onto the cracked asphalt, heading back down the coastal route. Celia kept glancing in the rearview mirror as if expecting a tail, but no one followed. That, if anything, made Mateo more uneasy. They don't need to follow us. They already know where we live. Upon arriving at the house, father and daughter retreated indoors. Celia fumed. If Trent was giving them info about the meeting, about everyone there, then we're in trouble. They'll know who's organizing. Maybe they'll come for us next. Mateo rubbed his temples, tension coiling in his brain. "We don't know the whole story yet, but I'll warn Benito and Dallas." He paused, considering the prospect of calling them on the phone. But phones could be tapped. Ultimately, he decided to meet Benito in person that evening. While Celia disappeared into her room to cool off, Mateo rummaged through the lockbox again, searching for any other clue that might lead to James. His mind buzzed with an idea forming in the background. If events spiraled out of control, he might need to track his brother down. He found nothing new. The same postcards, the same defunct phone number. Frustration welled up in him like a rising tide. Late afternoon arrived in a haze of scorching sun and dusty breeze. Mateo made Celia promise to stay behind and lock up. Then he drove to Benito's place, a modest house on the edge of a trailer park. Benito greeted him warily. "Heard anything?" he asked the moment Mateo stepped inside. Relaying the SUV incident near the boat ramp, Mateo watched Benito's expression grow troubled. "I knew that kid was jumpy, but I didn't think he'd go behind our backs." "Could be blackmail," Mateo suggested. "Or maybe he's just plain betraying us. Either way, we have to assume Helena Pierce now knows about the meeting, the participants, maybe even our plan to gather evidence." Benito let out a heavy sigh. He sat at a small kitchen table, absent-mindedly fingering a chipped coffee mug. "This is bad," he murmured. "We've got no real legal help on the horizon, and if the Bay Dogs want to crush us, they can do it easily. I've talked to a few folks. The new fees alone will bankrupt half our community within months, and that's if they don't start destroying property. It's only a matter of time before they escalate." Mateo sank into the seat across from him. So what do we do? Benito's jaw tightened. We fight or we run. I'm too old to start over somewhere else. I'll fight if I have to, but you've got Celia to think about. Maybe it's safer if you leave town. The notion of abandoning his home made Mateo's gut churn. But the idea that Celia might be targeted was even worse. Where would we go? I have no money for a big move. This is all we've ever known. Benito's gaze was sympathetic. I get it. Just don't wait too long if it comes to that. He hesitated, then reached into a drawer, pulling out a battered manila folder. Inside were several fuzzy photos, snapshots taken by local fishermen. One showed a group of bay dogs harassing a dock manager. Another captured a black SUV parked near someone's vandalized boat. There were also photocopies of receipts for unloading fees that had soared over the past month. It's not a lot of proof, but it's something. We were going to compile more before turning it in somewhere. Mateo thumbed through the folder, feeling a faint flicker of hope. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it might help if an outside agency ever took them seriously. Keep collecting, he said. I'll do the same. Benito nodded. They parted ways, each weighed down by the knowledge that time was running short. On the drive home, the sun dipped low, painting the horizon in bruised purples and oranges. Mateo's mind churned with worry. He remembered Helena Pierce's chilling composure. She was not the kind of adversary who offered second chances. The question was, when would she make her move? The answer came sooner than anyone expected. That night, as Celia tried to focus on homework, a series of popping noises echoed through the quiet street, sharp, staccato bursts. Mateo jerked upright from where he'd been reading on the couch. He rushed to the window and glimpsed headlights tearing away into the distance. Then he saw bullet holes splintered across the wooden fence out front. Two of their trash bins lay on their sides, riddled with holes. He dropped to the floor, heart pounding, yanking Celia down beside him. She was shaking, her breathing ragged. Another volley of shots cracked the night air, this time from farther away, as if someone was firing wildly down the street. Adrenaline surged in Mateo's veins. He reached for his phone to call 911. What else could he do? The dispatcher took his frantic statement but offered little assurance of immediate help. An officer will be dispatched when available, came the bored monotone. Damn it! He muttered under his breath. He peered out the window. The shooters were gone. Hopefully, they were just sending a warning this time, not trying to kill. But the message rang loud and clear. We know you're resisting, and we can get to you whenever we want. Celia's eyes brimmed with fear and anger. Papa, she rasped. They could have shot through the walls. He pulled her into a tight embrace. I know, Mija. It's okay. They're gone now. But it wasn't okay. Not by a long shot. When the police finally arrived, a single cruiser about 40 minutes later, they took a cursory report, shook their heads at the bullet holes, and offered nothing more than half-hearted platitudes. One of the officers, a tired older man, seemed genuinely sympathetic but powerless to help. The other officer looked at Mateo with thinly veiled disdain, as if expecting him to retract his statement. The entire investigation lasted maybe 10 minutes. Then they left. Father and daughter stood in the front yard, staring at the shattered fence under the flickering porch light. Celia's knuckles tightened around her hoodie sleeves. They're making an example of us. Mateo's voice was grim. Yes, he thought again of Benito's advice, fight or run. But he had no illusions that fleeing would keep them safe if the bay dogs wanted revenge. They would track them anywhere. Still, something else weighed on him, a dreadful premonition that bullets into a fence might not be the worst of it. Helena Pierce had the resources to orchestrate kidnappings, blackmail, and murder. Maybe she'd consider going after Celia or any of the children of the fishermen, if that's what it took to break the community's spirit. Mateo steeled himself. He couldn't rely on the police or even on his neighbors, to keep his daughter safe. If the Bay Dogs escalated further, he'd have to do something drastic. And in his chest, he felt the faint tug of hope that maybe his brother James was out there, somewhere capable of stepping in. Because if it came to raw force, nobody else in Mateo's world had the skill set of a Marine Raider trained for Black Ops. But for now, they were on their own. Another shot had been fired, literally, and the gloves were off. Chapter 6. A Storm Brews. 2 days passed like a slow march through thickening dread. The local grapevine buzzed with news of other drive-by intimidations. Shots fired into the air or into fences, but no reported injuries yet. It was as if the Bay Dogs were reminding everyone they could unleash real violence at any moment. Restaurants got visits from their representatives, demanding higher weekly fees. A few that had been waffling on payment quickly fell in line. Mateo and Celia tried to continue their routines as best they could. Celia still had school, though her concentration was shaky. Mateo still fished where he could, trying to earn enough money for groceries and to save a little for possible emergencies. The bullet holes in their fence remained as a haunting testament to how fragile their existence had become. On the second evening, Benito called to say that Dallas's boat had been vandalized. Slashed nets, severed fuel lines. He found a note pinned to the deck, Benito said grimly. It read, "Pay up or sink." No signatures, but we know who did it. Mateo's heart pounded with a fresh wave of anger. They're picking us off one by one. They are, Benito agreed. And I don't think they're going to wait for us to gather more evidence. I'm worried they'll do something worse soon. After hanging up, Mateo sat at the kitchen table, staring at the meager dinner he'd prepared: fried fish and boiled rice. Celia joined him, her face tense. "Papa, we can't just sit here. They might come again, worse than before." He closed his eyes. "I know." A swirl of conflicting emotions clouded him. Every day he considered the feasibility of leaving town, but a stubborn sense of loyalty to his home and neighbors kept him rooted. Plus, with so little money and no relatives in other states, besides the elusive James, where would they even go? Celia's gaze was locked on him. "You're thinking about Uncle James," she said softly. "I can see it. We should try harder to find him." Mateo exhaled shakily. "I asked around. No one's heard from him in ages. He moves around too much. We tried that phone number. Even if he's in the US, it could take months to track him down, if we succeed at all." Celia didn't relent. "But we owe it to ourselves to try. If we could just find one person who might know his whereabouts." Her voice trailed off as she pulled an old, dog-eared photograph from her pocket, one she'd taken from James's lockbox. It showed James standing beside 2 fellow Marines, all dressed in desert camouflage. On the back, someone had scribbled a date and the words "Brothers in Arms." "Keep in touch, Harlan and DeVries." Celia pointed to the faint scrawl of one name, Harlan. Mateo leaned in, reading the name more carefully. It occurred to him that if James had scrawled it there, maybe this Harlan was a close friend, possibly still stateside. "We have no idea how to find him," Mateo muttered. "But maybe, just maybe we could do some digging. Ask on social media, phone directories. I don't know." Celia's eyes sparked with renewed energy. "Then let's try it. If it's a dead end, at least we tried." He couldn't argue with that. They spent the next hour rummaging through old items, searching for any slip of paper that might reference a Harlan. They found none. Eventually, Celia powered up their ancient home computer. She tried searching for Harlan, Marine, and approximate service years, but it yielded an avalanche of unrelated data. They tried adding the partial last name from the scribbled note, illegible except for the first letter, G, and it led nowhere conclusive. After 2 hours, Celia sat back, shoulders slumped. Mateo sighed. It was worth a shot. He ruffled her hair softly. "We'll keep this in mind, but let's not get too obsessed. We still have to handle our day-to-day and watch our backs." She nodded, reluctantly. They cleaned up dinner, each lost in their own thoughts. In bed that night, Mateo wondered if perhaps the father-daughter duo should go on the run, heading inland, maybe find farm work somewhere. The notion felt like surrender, but the alternative was risking Celia's life. He tossed and turned, drifting in and out of fretful sleep. In the dark hours before dawn, a vicious thunderstorm swept through, battering the coast with howling winds and horizontal rain. The house rattled, tree branches scraping the windows. Lightning flared, illuminating the yard with eerie brilliance. Mateo lay awake, listening to the storm's relentless fury, thinking how it matched his inner turmoil. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving everything soaked and battered. Fallen debris littered the roads, and the humidity was stifling. Mateo steered his truck carefully around puddles and broken limbs as he dropped Celia off at her school. She wore a tight expression, obviously bracing for another day of uneasy vigilance. "Papa," she said, pausing before climbing out. "Be safe. Promise." He forced a reassuring nod. "Promise." He tried to fish again that day, but the water was too churned up from the storm. Returning with an empty cooler, he drove home, noting the black SUV parked near the marina. No sign of Helena Pierce herself, but her watchers remained vigilant. The air felt electric with coming conflict. When he pulled into his driveway, an envelope taped to his front door caught his eye. A chill ran through him. He approached cautiously, half expecting it to be another threat. But as he tore it open, he found something else. The Polaroid snapshot of Celia at the marina from months ago. She was wearing a life jacket, smiling wide. Beneath the photo, scrawled in an elegant looping hand, was a single sentence. "We're watching." The edges of the Polaroid were singed, as though it had been held over a flame but not quite destroyed. Mateo stared, horror tightening his chest. Someone had deliberately snapped that photo in secret, or maybe they'd stolen it from somewhere. Either way, it was a direct threat. "We can reach your daughter." His hand shook with fury and fear. Right then, in that moment, a line was crossed. His mind roared. If they so much as touched Celia, he bolted inside, double-checking every room, but the house was empty, quiet. No sign of forced entry. Slumping against the wall, he tried to gather his racing thoughts. They were escalating. The question was, how far would they go? By the time Celia came home from school, he'd hidden the Polaroid so as not to panic her. But his tension must have shown, because she studied his face intently. "Papa, what happened?" He almost lied, but decided the time for sugarcoating was over. He showed her the photograph and the note. Her hands trembled as she realized the significance. "They're targeting me now," she whispered. Mateo forced a grim set to his jaw. "We won't let them. I won't let them." She swallowed. "We need Uncle James," she said again, her voice nearly cracking. "There's no way around it." He pressed his eyes shut. He knew she wasn't wrong, but James remained an elusive ghost. With no new leads, what else could they do? One thing was certain. The storm brewing on the coast was about to break. And when it did, the Bay Dogs would show no mercy. Chapter 7. The Taking. That Saturday, a community fundraiser was held at the local church, ostensibly to help repair storm damage to the building, though everyone suspected the gathering was also a chance for neighbors to check on each other amid the rising tensions. Mateo hesitated to bring Celia, worried it might be too public, but she insisted. "We can't hide forever," she said, steel in her voice. They arrived in the late afternoon. The church, a humble clapboard structure with a sagging steeple, buzzed with activity. Children played tag in the yard while volunteers served bowls of gumbo from large kettles. The smell of spices and cooking onions wafted through the humid air. A small band tried to liven the scene with folksy tunes. Benito was there, handing out bowls of gumbo. Marisol and Dallas circulated with sign-up sheets for a volunteer coastal cleanup. Partly a pretext, Mateo knew, to keep watch on each other's boats. Yet the mood felt subdued, overshadowed by fear of the bay dogs. Fathers kept a vigilant eye on their kids. Mothers exchanged anxious looks, scanning for suspicious newcomers. Mateo and Celia tried to relax, mingling with a few acquaintances. Celia helped serve gumbo to an elderly couple. For a moment, her youthful spark returned as she smiled politely. Mateo leaned against a table, chatting with Benito about the meager fish haul that week, each man glancing around now and then to ensure no uninvited guests lurked. Suddenly, the music cut off with a discordant twang. A hush fell. All eyes turned to the small gravel parking lot, where two black SUVs had pulled in. Doors opened, and a handful of men in black windbreakers stepped out. The tension spiked. Benito set down his ladle, muttering an oath under his breath. A path opened among the attendees like parted waters as Helena Pierce emerged from the lead vehicle. She wore a crisp linen suit, hair impeccably styled. Her polite smile was the epitome of cold, calculating confidence. Surveying the crowd, she walked with her usual predatory grace. No one spoke as she approached the gumbo tables. Her men fanned out behind her, hands resting conspicuously near the bulges under their jackets. Children were ushered away by frightened parents. Mateo felt Celia press close to his side, trembling. Benito glowered, fists clenched. Helena's cool gaze swept across the silent throng. Finally, she spotted Benito and Mateo, and her smile broadened as though greeting old friends. "What a lovely gathering," she said, voice dripping with faux warmth. "I do admire this sense of community spirit." No one responded. The only sound was the simmer of gumbo and the distant whir of cicadas. Helena's men exchanged smirks, enjoying the show of intimidation. After a beat, Helena nodded toward the donation box set up on a folding table. "Collecting funds, I see. How quaint. Perhaps I should donate. I believe in supporting local institutions that cooperate with us." Benito found his voice, taut with anger. "We didn't invite you." Her smile remained. "You didn't," she acknowledged. "But it's a free country, isn't it? I was curious about how this community organizes, especially under stressful conditions. We all have so much to gain if we work together." Mateo stepped forward, heart hammering, though he tried to keep his tone steady. "If this is your way of pressuring the church to pay fees, that's a new low." Her head tilted in feigned surprise. "I'd never do such a thing. The church is a pillar of the community. But I would appreciate a word with you, Mateo." Her eyes flicked to Celia, then back. Privately, a jolt of protective instinct flared within him. "Anything you need to say, you can say here." Helena's expression darkened marginally. "Very well." She spoke louder, letting the crowd overhear. "You and others like you have been refusing our fair proposals. We've endured your petty defiance, but that can only go on for so long." Her gaze swept the room, lingering on Benito, Dallas, Marisol, and others who had been at the cannery meeting. "I've tried to be diplomatic, but we can't have people undermining our future plans for the port. Cooperation is mandatory." A ripple of fear and anger ran through the gathering. Dallas set his jaw. "We won't be bullied forever." One of Helena's men gave a low chuckle, as if to say, "We'll see." Helena simply nodded, as though making a mental note of Dallas's face. Then her attention returned to Celia. "Such a bright young lady," she said softly, her tone eerie in its gentleness. "We wouldn't want anything to happen to her, or any of the children in this community." Mateo tried to steady his voice. "Leave her out of this." Helena studied him a moment, then sighed. "We won't remain patient much longer. I recommend you take our offer before it's too late." Turning on her heel, she began walking back to the SUVs, her men in tow. The crowd parted again in a tense hush. Mateo let out a shaky breath as they left, but the dread in his chest only tightened. Helena had come openly, letting everyone know she was confident enough to walk into their territory without fear. A statement in broad daylight, "You can't touch me." The event resumed in a nervous, diminished fashion. Parents hurried their children home. The sense of fellowship frayed under the knowledge that the Bay Dogs were watching every move. Eventually, the fundraiser ended early, collecting far less money than hoped. People drifted away, heads bowed. Mateo and Celia lingered to help clean up. Benito approached them, frowning. "Did you see how Pierce stared at Celia?" He kept his voice low. "It's like she was picking a target. You need to watch her like a hawk." Mateo nodded grimly, clenching his fists. "I will." They headed home before dusk, both feeling shaken. Celia went to her room, trying to distract herself with homework, though Mateo doubted she could concentrate. He paced the living room, mind racing. The photograph threat, the drive-by shooting, the brazen confrontation at the church. The pattern was clear. Helena was turning the screws, pushing them toward capitulation. In the deep hours of the night, rest eluded him. Around 2 a.m., he dozed on the couch only to be jerked awake by the sound of the front door rattling. He shot up, adrenaline flooding his veins. He dashed to Celia's room, empty. The bed covers were tossed aside. Panic exploded in his mind. "Celia," he hissed. No answer. He grabbed a flashlight, heart hammering dangerously fast, and burst outside. The yard lay quiet under the moonlight, fence riddled with old bullet holes. No sign of movement. He shouted her name into the darkness, dread twisting his gut. Had she wandered out, or had someone forced their way in? He checked the backyard, the side alley, shining the flashlight in frantic sweeps. Nothing. Then he spotted it. A single fresh set of tire tracks in the dirt along the curb, as if a vehicle had pulled up hastily. And on the ground, a battered tennis shoe that belonged to Celia. Mateo's chest constricted. She wouldn't go anywhere alone at this hour. This had to be a kidnapping. His mind reeled. He tried calling her phone straight to voicemail. Fear slammed into him like a tidal wave. He dialed 911, a sick feeling in his stomach even as the line rang. The operator answered, sounding groggy. "My daughter's been taken," he gasped. "I need the police now." The dispatcher tried to calm him, promising to send a unit. But Mateo knew how worthless that might be. The Bay Dogs could have taken Celia to any number of hideouts, some vacant building near the port or out in the swamps. Helena Pierce had infinite resources to vanish without a trace. Pacing the sidewalk, he raked his hands through his hair, eyes wild with panic. They have Celia, the one person he loved more than life itself, the one precious soul he'd die to protect. And now the Bay Dogs had her in their clutches. The darkness of the street seemed to press in on him, mocking his helplessness. He sank to his knees, a raw cry tearing from his throat. "Celia!" He roared into the empty night. No answer but the soft rustle of leaves in the ocean breeze. In that moment, something inside Mateo snapped. Any lingering fear of retaliation evaporated, replaced by an unquenchable fury. If the Bay Dogs wanted a war, they had one. But he couldn't fight alone. He needed an ally who understood how to wage a battle in the shadows. He needed James. Chapter 8. Desperate Measures. 3 days. That was how long Celia had been missing, and it felt like an eternity of sleepless nights, frantic phone calls, and fruitless leads. The sheriff's department took a missing person report, but their search was cursory at best. They found no sign of forced entry beyond the scuffed door handle, no witnesses who saw a struggle. Helena Pierce's name never appeared on any official record, and none of her men had left obvious evidence. The local media barely mentioned the disappearance of a fisherman's daughter. A single blurb overshadowed by bigger state news. Mateo was coming apart at the seams. He refused to eat, pacing the house in a daze. He'd visited Benito, Dallas, and every other fisherman he knew. None had any clue where the bay dogs might stash a hostage. He checked every rumor of an abandoned dock house or empty warehouse. Nothing. It was as if she'd vanished into thin air, swallowed by the night. Meanwhile, a new wave of extortion demands flooded the port. Boats were seized if owners couldn't pay. Some men caved entirely, signing contracts that effectively made them indentured labor for the bay dogs. Others fled, loading their families into cars to start over elsewhere. The community was unraveling, and Celia's kidnapping proved that Helena Pierce would cross any line to break the last holdouts. On the fourth morning after Celia vanished, Mateo sat in his living room with Benito, who came bearing coffee and moral support. Dark circles lined Mateo's eyes, and his hair stuck out in tufts from desperate fingers clawing at his scalp. "They want me to fold," he rasped. "They took her because they know she's all I have." Benito put a hand on his shoulder. "We'll get her back. We'll find a way." "How?" Mateo's tone dripped with anguish. "The cops do nothing. The feds won't listen to a bunch of poor fishermen. Helena is too connected." He stared at a framed photo of Celia on the mantel, tears threatening to choke him. "She must be so scared." Benito shut his eyes, pained. After a long silence, he spoke hesitantly. "James, you need him now more than ever. Let me ask around. Your brother's name might ring a bell with some old Marines who passed through the fish market." Mateo nodded, hopeless but clinging to any lifeline. Benito got up, promising to search every corner of his contacts. Hours later, he returned with a slip of paper and a triumphant glint. "There's a guy over in Four Rivers County, about 2 hours inland, who might have served with James. Name's DeVries, apparently the same DeVries from that photo. He's now working as a private security consultant. I got a phone number from a friend of a friend. It's a long shot, but call him. Maybe he knows how to reach James." Mateo grabbed the paper, hope flaring for the first time since the kidnapping. He dialed the number with shaking fingers. It rang several times before a gruff, suspicious voice answered. "DeVries speaking. Who is this?" I'm Mateo Barrera. You served with my brother, James Barrera, in the Marine Raiders. Please, do you know how I can find him? It's urgent. My daughter's been kidnapped. I have nowhere else to turn." For a moment, there was only the crackle of the line. Finally, DeVries exhaled. "James, we parted ways a while ago. That man's been drifting for years, fighting his own demons. But I might have a contact for him. No promises." Mateo's voice shook with gratitude. "Anything. Please, I'll pay you." "Don't worry about that," DeVries said. "Hang tight. I'll see what I can do." He hung up abruptly, a flicker of hope. It wasn't guaranteed, but it was better than nothing. Mateo gripped the phone, heart pounding. For the rest of the day, he paced the house, jumping at every ring. Evening came, then night, with no word. Sleep was impossible. He kept reliving nightmares of Celia locked in some dark room, crying out for him. The call came at midnight. Mateo lunged for the phone. "Hello, it's DeVries," came the low rumble on the other end. "I tracked down a guy named Harlan G. in the Florida Panhandle who might have James's current location. I gave him your number. Expect a call soon." Mateo closed his eyes, relief warring with fear. "Thank you." True to his word, an hour later the phone rang again. This time, a younger-sounding voice introduced himself as Harlan. "DeVries told me what's happening. I was deployed with James off and on for a couple years. We kept in touch. He's out near Corpus Christi these days, living in a rundown trailer by the bay." Mateo's pulse leapt. Corpus Christi's just a few hours away from here. Do you have a phone number for him? Pause. He changes phones like underwear, but I have an address. Last I spoke to him was 2 months ago. He was going through a rough patch. Don't know if he's even in a place to help, but I'll give you what I have. Grabbing a pen, Mateo scribbled the address. Thank you, he breathed. I'm leaving first thing in the morning. It might be a dead end, Harlan warned. But if you find him, tell him Harlan said to pick up next time I call. Good luck, man. They hung up. Mateo let out a ragged exhale. At least he had a direction, Corpus Christi. Maybe James would be there. Maybe not. But if he was, it could be Celia's only chance. He wasted no time. He left a message on Benito's phone, explaining that he was heading out to find James. Then he gathered some clothes, a bit of cash, and locked up the house. He tossed the old photo of James in his bag as well, a reminder of who he was searching for. Before dawn, he climbed into his pickup, the sky still purple with night. Every nerve hummed with urgency. As he rolled onto the highway, he wondered how many hours Celia had left before the Bay Dogs decided she was expendable. Helena Pierce didn't like to drag things out once the point was made. Mateo gripped the wheel, tears burning his eyes. His daughter's face haunted him. Hold on, Mija. Just hold on. The drive south was a blur of dull highways and passing headlights. Anxiety pounded in Mateo's chest with each mile. He had no idea what he'd find when he got there. James might be half dead in some bar, or he might have already skipped town. But the memory of his brother's quiet, lethal competence pulled him onward. James had once been unstoppable, a man who specialized in missions nobody else wanted. If that same man still existed beneath the scars, maybe there was hope. As dawn broke, he reached the outskirts of Corpus Christi, a sprawling city hugging the Gulf with its own tangle of refineries and warehouses. Following the directions, he left the main thoroughfare and meandered through a maze of side streets, passing corrugated shacks and junkyards. At last, he found the trailer park indicated on the scrap of paper. It was a dismal place, potholed roads winding between battered single-wides, rusted cars on cinder blocks dotted weedy yards. A lone dog barked somewhere, and the stench of rotten garbage hung in the humid air. Mateo pulled up to the trailer number Harlan had given him, 48B. The structure looked one strong gust away from collapse. He killed the engine, heart hammering. Is James really here? Swallowing his nerves, he knocked on the flimsy door. No answer. He knocked harder. Still nothing. A neighbor, a wiry woman with a cigarette, peered out from the adjacent lot. He ain't home, she called, voice scratchy. Saw him leave last night. Didn't say where. Desperation clenched Mateo's gut. Does he come back often? She shrugged. He's in and out. Keeps to himself. Mateo cursed under his breath. He tried the door, locked. Peering through a grimy window, he saw a cramped interior scattered with empty bottles, gear, maybe a duffel bag. If James had left the area, that address might be worthless. But he couldn't give up. Thanks, he said hastily, heading back to his truck. He slumped in the driver's seat, mind spinning. Now what? He decided to wait. Maybe James would return soon. He had no other leads. So he sat there, the mid-morning sun climbing high, sweat beading on his forehead. Hours crept by with no sign of life. He made calls to Benito, who had no news on Celia. Each hour felt like a year. By early afternoon, hunger and frustration mounted, but he refused to leave. He was on the verge of dozing off in the stifling heat when a battered motorcycle rumbled into view. The rider wore a half helmet and dusty jeans, face partially concealed by sunglasses and a bandana. Mateo straightened. The figure pulled up to trailer 48B, cut the engine, and swung off in a fluid motion. With a trembling breath, Mateo recognized the shape of the man's shoulders. the same broad stance from their childhood. It had to be James. Heart racing, Mateo leapt out and approached. The rider stiffened, sliding off the shades, revealing eyes that flicked from confusion to wary recognition. He had a rough beard, new scars across his temple, and a haunted, hollow look. But it's him. It's James. "Brother," Mateo croaked. His throat felt tight. James said nothing at first, just stared as if seeing a ghost. Then he spoke in a guarded tone. "Mateo, what are you doing here?" Mateo's chest tightened with grief and relief, tears threatening. "James, I need your help. Celia, she's been kidnapped." Those words shattered the distance between them. James's eyes darkened, and his posture shifted. The haunted emptiness took on a sharper, lethal edge, as though a sleeping beast had stirred. "Start talking," he said quietly. Mateo did, unloading every detail of Helena Pierce, the bay dogs, the threats, the final abduction. As the words poured out, James's expression turned to stone. Beneath the veneer of fatigue and pain, something fierce glimmered. When Mateo finished, James's jaw flexed. "They took your daughter," he echoed as if testing the words. "And you need me to get her back." Mateo nodded, tears brimming. "I have no one else. The police won't do anything. These criminals run the port. If we don't stop them, Celia..." His voice broke. James drew a slow breath. "All right," he said, voice low and dangerous. "Let me grab my gear." In that single statement, hope flared in Mateo's chest. James might be broken, but he was still a Marine Raider, still the unstoppable one. And now, with nothing left to lose, James was about to wage war on the Bay Dogs. Chapter 9. Unfinished Business. They talked inside the cramped trailer, the air stale with old cigarette smoke and leftover takeout. James cleared off a cluttered table, pushing aside half-empty bottles and battered road maps. He laid out a well-worn duffel bag, unzipping it to reveal items that made Mateo's eyes widen. A pistol, a combat knife, tactical gloves, and a tangle of ropes and climbing gear. It was a glimpse into James's life, perpetually prepared for conflict, even in self-imposed exile. Mateo quietly explained everything he knew about Helena Pierce, the Bay Dogs, and the local layout. He described the extensive dock areas, the shipping warehouses, and possible abandoned spots where Celia might be held. James took notes, eyes flicking with the cool efficiency of a man reverting to combat mode. His questions were direct. Who are her main lieutenants? Does she keep regular schedules? Any known safe houses? What local law enforcement is compromised? Mateo did his best to answer, referencing scraps of rumors from Benito and other fishermen. James's expression grew grim. "We need intel, real intel. Until we know exactly where they're keeping Celia, we can't risk a frontal assault. They'll harm her if they feel cornered." The mention of his niece made James pause, raw emotion flickering across his face. He covered it quickly with a hardened mask. "We'll do this smart or not at all," he said. Mateo nodded, determined. "I'll do whatever it takes." They decided to drive back to the coast that very day. James loaded his motorcycle onto the bed of Mateo's pickup, securing it with straps. He refused to speak much about his own life, offering only clipped responses to Mateo's halting attempts at small talk. The war had taken a toll. His eyes were distant, voice curt. But the moment they discussed the Bay Dogs, a cold fire lit behind his gaze. They reached Mateo's home by late evening. James took stock of the bullet-riddled fence and the battered interior. Benito arrived soon after, cautious but grateful to see James in the flesh. "So you're the Marine Raider," Benito said with a weak smile. "We've been hoping you'd show up." James studied him. "You can help me with local names, locations. We need a list of suspected hideouts." Benito bobbed his head, rummaging in his bag for the manila folder of evidence. James flicked through the photos and receipts impassively, occasionally asking clarifying questions about times and places. At last, he exhaled. If they have Celia, they've likely moved her somewhere secure. She's leverage. Helena Pierce won't risk leaving her in a random shack that can be easily discovered. That's what we assumed, Mateo said, exhaustion thick in his voice. She might be in one of the bigger warehouses or some remote hideout we've never heard of. James rubbed a hand over his bearded jaw. We need eyes on them. If Helena Pierce operates publicly, she'll have a circle of enforcers. We tail them, identify their routines, find out where they converge. We might have to follow them for days, but we'll do it. Meanwhile, we keep our presence quiet. If we tip them off, they'll move Celia, or worse. Tears threatened in Mateo's eyes. Days sounded unbearable, knowing his daughter was locked away, terrified. But James's calm authority was the only thing keeping him grounded now. All right, he whispered. They planned for hours. Benito offered to rope in Dallas and Marisol for discreet scouting around the port. James insisted on a small team. Too many would attract attention. We'll rotate watchers, he said. Don't do anything that stands out. Finally, Benito headed home. James sank onto a worn armchair, rummaging through his duffel for a small notebook. Mateo tentatively asked, "How have you been?" James didn't look up. "Alive," he said curtly. Silence stretched, thick with unspoken wounds. Mateo took a shaky breath. "I'm sorry I haven't reached out. After Maria died, Celia needed me and you were on your tours. By the time you returned, you seemed..." He trailed off. James's eyes flicked over, hard. "Seemed what?" "Hurt. Angry. I didn't know how to help. Then you left again." A stormy flicker of pain crossed James's face. "I was a different man after that last deployment. I had no place here." He paused, the tension in his voice obvious. "But that's ancient history. Right now, we focus on Celia." Mateo nodded, deciding not to push further. That night, they set up a rotation. James insisted on sleeping in short bursts, his senses sharp for any sign of a raid on the house. Mateo tried to rest, but images of Celia's face taunted him. He half expected a phone call demanding ransom, but none came. It was as if Helena simply wanted them to suffer, uncertain and powerless. At dawn, James got up and rifled through a bag for a worn camouflage jacket. "Time to gather intel," he said. "I'll take your truck. You stay here in case she tries to call, or they contact you." Mateo bristled at the idea of waiting around, but he recognized James's expertise. "All right," he agreed reluctantly, "but radio me if you find anything." James gave a terse nod and slipped out. Watching him go, Mateo felt a rush of conflicting feelings. Relief, guilt, fear. He wanted to be in the thick of the search, but James needed stealth, and a single occupant in the truck was less conspicuous. Father and uncle both had the same goal, but James had the training to act, while Mateo could only wait. Time crawled by. Midday turned scorching. Benito dropped by with updates. Dallas and Marisol had quietly tailed a couple of Helena's men, observing them as they made their rounds to restaurants and fishing charters, collecting fees. No sign of Celia. It wasn't surprising. The gang wouldn't risk letting her out in daylight. They might keep her chained in some windowless back room. A wave of rage and despair threatened to crush Mateo. If anything happened to his daughter, he might never recover. He paced the living room, imagining the worst. The rest of the day dragged on with no word from James. Evening fell, the house sweltering in the late summer heat, and still no call. Anxiety gnawed at Mateo. He half expected the phone to ring with James's terse voice or some horrifying ultimatum from Helena. Finally, near dusk, headlights swept across the yard. Mateo rushed out to find James climbing from the truck, face set in grim lines. "I've got a lead," James said quietly, handing over a small slip of paper scrawled with addresses. "I tailed one of her top lieutenants. Stocky guy with an anchor tattoo on his forearm." Mateo's eyes narrowed. "I've seen him before." James continued. "He visited a shuttered canning facility on the north side of the port, then a rundown warehouse by the river. That second place had armed guards posted discreetly. Could be nothing, or it could be where they're keeping high-value hostages." Mateo's heart pounded. "We have to check it." James nodded. "Tonight, under cover of darkness. But we do it quietly. If it's the wrong place, we back out. If we find her..." His voice trailed, eyes darkening. "We move fast." They prepared in tense silence. James loaded his pistol, checking the magazine. He gave Mateo an older revolver for self-defense. "Can you handle this?" Mateo nodded, though he hadn't fired a gun in years. "Yes. Only use it if absolutely necessary," James warned. "We don't want to start a gunfight unless we have no choice." Darkness fell fully, a sliver of moon overhead. They set out on foot from a side street near the warehouse, parking the truck well away to avoid suspicion. The stench of the tide rolled in, thick and pungent. Industrial fencing lined the perimeter, and faint lights glimmered from the warehouse windows, partially boarded up. A single overhead lamp illuminated the main door, where two men smoked cigarettes, rifles slung over their shoulders. James motioned for Mateo to keep low. They crept around the rear, hugging the shadows. In the distance, a barge horn sounded on the river, and the wind rattled a piece of sheet metal. They found a side entrance with a heavy padlock. James examined it briefly. "We can't pick this without making noise," he whispered. "Let's see if there's another way." Circling around, they located a broken window about 10 feet up. James tapped Mateo's shoulder and gestured for a boost. Heart thrumming, Mateo cupped his hands to help James climb. The Marine raider pulled himself onto the ledge in fluid silence, then turned and reached down to haul Mateo up. Pain shot through Mateo's arms, but adrenaline pushed him on. Soon they both teetered on the narrow sill. James peered inside. Darkness reigned except for a flickering fluorescent light in a distant hallway. The smell of musty concrete hung in the stagnant air. Carefully, James slithered through the window. Mateo followed, landing on creaking pallets below. They crouched, straining to hear anything. Voices, footsteps, Celia's cry for help. The building's gloom pressed around them. In the distance, they heard the murmur of men talking, the clang of metal. James eased forward, motioning for Mateo to keep close. Step by step, they made their way along a corridor lined with shipping crates. The voices grew louder, but no words were distinct. Then James froze, pressing himself against a corner. Mateo followed suit, hearing footsteps approaching. A man with a rifle slung across his back strolled into view, shining a flashlight at the dusty floor. For a heart-stopping moment, the beam hovered near them, but James held himself perfectly still in the shadows. The man moved on, heading toward the main entrance. Once the footsteps receded, James beckoned for Mateo to continue deeper into the building. They searched room after room, finding nothing but empty storage space. Another corridor led to a stairwell, from which faint light glowed. James pointed upward. Creeping up the stairs, they fought the squeak of each step. At the top, a short hallway ended in a heavy metal door. Dim light leaked from beneath it. James put his ear to the door, straining. Someone inside was speaking, the voice muffled. Mateo's chest hammered. Could Celia be in there? He locked eyes with James, whose expression was steely. James eased the doorknob, but it was locked from the inside. No easy way in without forcing it. Then, from within, came a chilling sound, a stifled whimper. Mateo's heart nearly burst. "Celia?" James's eyes flashed. He nodded to the door. They had seconds to decide. If they tried to force it quietly, they risked alerting whoever was inside. If they made a direct breach, it would be loud. Before they could act, a voice rose inside, deep and angry, cursing about increasing the pressure, about no more freebies. A second voice whimpered. Then a hard slap cut through the air, followed by a small cry. Definitely female. Mateo's soul ignited in rage. He gripped the revolver, hands trembling. James placed a steadying hand on Mateo's arm, then withdrew a slim pry tool from his pocket. He inserted it into the door's latch, applying pressure to the frame. The seconds dragged in excruciating silence. Finally, a soft click. James whispered, "Cover me." He twisted the knob slowly, letting the door crack open an inch. Inside, they glimpsed a dimly lit office space. A single overhead lamp flickered, revealing two men standing over a terrified woman. But it wasn't Celia. She appeared older, maybe mid-20s. Her face was bruised, eyes wide. She was tied to a chair, gagged. One man barked a question at her, tearing the gag away momentarily, but she only sobbed. Crushing disappointment warred with fury. This was some other hostage. Celia was nowhere in sight, but Mateo couldn't just leave her there. He met James's gaze. James nodded, an unspoken understanding passing between them. "We free her, quietly if possible." In a sudden, fluid motion, James burst through the door. Before the men could react, he smashed the butt of his pistol into the nearest one's temple. The second reached for his weapon, but Mateo stepped in, revolver trembling. James lunged, knocking the gun aside and delivering a swift elbow strike to the man's jaw, sending him sprawling. Both men were down, dazed. James knelt, pressing his pistol to the nearest man's chest. "Who else is in the building?" he hissed. Mateo quickly moved to the woman, untying her hands. She sobbed in relief. "Thank you," she gasped, voice hoarse. They took me from my job last week. Said my boss owed money. I don't know how many are here." James's captive spat blood, glancing at the door. We're not telling you anything, you?" His defiance ended with James's fist slamming into his jaw, knocking him cold. The woman clung to Mateo, trembling. "Are there more like me?" she whispered. Mateo's throat tightened. "Maybe. My daughter." He couldn't finish. James pointed to the door. "We need to move now. The rest will have heard that scuffle." Sure enough, voices sounded in the hallway. Boots pounded. James rose, adrenaline flaring. "We're trapped," he muttered. "This place is hot." Mateo guided the rescued woman behind him, brandishing the revolver. The door was open, and they heard shouts from the corridor. "They're in here." James's jaw set. "We'll fight our way out if we have to. But Celia's not here." Mateo felt a crushing sense of failure. So close, yet so far. Shots rang out, echoing in the cramped space. A bullet tore through the flimsy wall, missing them by inches. James cursed. "We go out the window if there is one." They rushed to the far side of the office, finding a small window that led onto a narrow fire escape. James used his pry tool to smash the latch, then shoved it open. "Move!" he barked. Mateo hoisted the woman through, and then they scrambled onto the shaky metal landing. A door behind them burst open. Gunfire cracked in the office. Bullets pinged off the fire escape rail. James fired back twice, forcing the men to duck. Then he leapt onto the ladder, descending 3 rungs at a time. The rescued hostage whimpered in terror, but Mateo guided her down, heart thundering. They dropped to the alley below, where rusting dumpsters offered partial cover. Shouts came from above. Another volley of gunfire rattled the night. James waved them toward a chain-link fence at the alley's end. With adrenaline spiking, they sprinted, bullets whining overhead. They scaled the fence, dropping to the other side in a tangle of limbs. Then they ran, ignoring the throbbing pain of minor scrapes. At last, they burst onto a side street, lungs burning. A few more shots rang out behind them, but they dove behind a parked truck. Moments later, James gestured for them to keep moving. Within minutes, they found their own vehicle, flung open the doors, and roared away. Back at Mateo's house, they collapsed in the living room. The young woman, sobbing, explained between gasps that she was a waitress at a local diner whose owner refused to pay the Bay Dog's new fees. Helena's men had snatched her after her shift. She had no idea where Celia might be. Mateo's hands shook with exhaustion and heartbreak. James rubbed sweat from his brow, eyes fierce. They're holding multiple hostages, using them as leverage for compliance. This is bigger than I thought. Tears glistened on Mateo's cheeks. We were so close. I thought she might be there. James placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. We're not done yet. This is only the beginning. We'll tear their entire operation apart if we have to. A flicker of unstoppable resolve flashed in James's eyes, overshadowed by sorrow and rage. This was the man who had once stormed enemy strongholds. The man who had nothing left to lose, except perhaps the chance to save his niece. And for the Bay Dogs, that made him more dangerous than they could ever imagine. Chapter 10. Fanning the Flames. In the aftermath of the failed search, the rescued waitress, her name was Nina, huddled at Mateo's house, too terrified to return to her own place. After hearing her tale, Benito and Marisol came by in a flurry of whispered concern. They arranged a safe spot for Nina in a friend's spare room, outside of town, hoping the Bay Dogs wouldn't track her down. She left, trembling but thankful to be free. James wasted no time regrouping. We need to multiply our efforts, he told the small gathering that now included Benito, Marisol, Dallas, and a couple of other trusted locals. They sat in Mateo's living room, tension crackling in the air. Helena Pierce has created a network of hostages, one in each area of business. This is how she forces compliance. Celia's presumably in a more secure location, given she's direct family to a resistor. Dallas rubbed his calloused hands over his face. We tried to gather evidence before, but it's not enough to bring the feds in time. And now they're kidnapping folks left and right. We can't stand by. James nodded grimly. Agreed. So we ramp up. Step 1, we track down more potential hideouts. Step 2, we sow confusion among the Bay Dogs. Force them to shift resources, make mistakes, reveal Celia's location. Step 3, we be ready for a rescue mission. Marisol exchanged an uneasy glance with Benito. How do we sow confusion against a gang that has better guns and money? A ghost of a smile touched James's lips. Cold, predatory. Think about their supply lines. They must move contraband, or at least launder money, through the port. If we disrupt their logistical operations, jam up trucks, sabotage certain shipments, maybe blow up their stash spots, they'll scramble. That means pulling men from guard duty or forcing them to relocate hostages. Mateo's eyes widened at the mention of blowing things up. Are we prepared for that? James shrugged. I've done more with less. He softened slightly. We'll try not to harm any innocents or cause undue property damage. But we have to hit them where it hurts. Benito inhaled sharply, as though crossing a moral threshold. If it helps save Celia, count me in. Dallas, too, looked uneasy but nodded. We're in. Tell us what to do. James laid out a plan. Benito and Marisol would keep ears to the ground for any rumored shipments or trucks the Bay Dogs might be expecting. Dallas would gather some old fishing buddies who could operate small boats for nighttime mischief, like intercepting contraband shipments or blocking pier access. Meanwhile, James would carefully select a target for sabotage. A pipeline of illegal cargo rumored to run through a small shipping office on the outskirts of the port. If they could sabotage that pipeline, The Bay Dogs would be forced to investigate, potentially thinning their security around hostages. Throughout the discussion, Mateo hovered at James's side, torn between admiration for his brother's methodical brilliance and fear of spiraling violence. But every time he pictured Celia's frightened face, his resolve hardened. Whatever it takes. When the group left to set preparations in motion, James caught Mateo's arm. "I'll need your help with the sabotage. I can't do it alone." Mateo nodded, swallowing hard. "I'll do anything." That night, they made quiet rounds in the shadows near the docks, mapping out guard posts, checking security cameras, and noting the comings and goings of vehicles. Occasionally, a black SUV rolled past, but the watchers inside never noticed the two men blending into dark corners. James wore a hoodie and kept his face partially hidden. Mateo did the same. It felt surreal, like being in an undercover operation in some war-torn city, rather than their own hometown. They discovered that one small shipping office, marked Gulf Star Freight, seemed to have an unusual amount of traffic after midnight. Crates were loaded onto unmarked vans under the watch of armed men. James recognized the pattern of contraband movement. "This is a weak link," he said. "If we sabotage it, they'll shift focus here for days." "But how do we blow it up?" Mateo whispered, nerves shaking. "We don't have grenades or anything." James glanced at him. "I've seen enough to know everyday materials can do the trick. We just need the right approach. Fire or well-placed ignition near their crate stockpile. We don't want a massive explosion that kills everyone. Just enough to ruin their operation and send a message." Mateo's stomach nodded, but he nodded. The line between vigilante justice and outright terrorism felt razor-thin. Yet the memory of Celia overshadowed all moral qualms. They set the sabotage for 2 nights later. In the interim, Benito and Marisol spread subtle misinformation, leaking hints to certain bar owners that the local fishermen were planning a protest near the main marina. The idea was to draw some of Helena's men to that location at the appointed time, leaving Gulf Star Freight with minimal guard staff. On the night in question, James and Mateo arrived at the shipping office just before midnight. They wore dark clothes, faces smeared with soot to obscure features. Mateo carried a duffel containing fuel canisters and a few homemade incendiary devices that James had rigged using fireworks and gas-soaked rags. The plan was simple but dangerous. Slip onto the property, plant the devices around the crate stockpile, set a timer or remote spark, and then get out. A chill wind blew off the Gulf, rustling trash in the deserted lot behind the freight office. They crouched behind a rusted dumpster, watching the target. As expected, guard presence was lighter than usual, only a couple of men patrolling with flashlights. James whispered instructions. "You circle around to the east side, near that chain-link fence. Plant the first device behind those stacked crates. I'll do the west side. When you're done, meet back here, we trigger the spark, and then vanish." Mateo's heart hammered. He wiped sweaty palms on his pants. "Got it." They split. Using the shadows, Mateo crept along the fence line until he reached the crate stacks. He nearly stumbled over a coil of rope, catching himself just in time. A guard's flashlight swept past, but he pressed himself against the crates, breath held. The guard moved on. Quietly, Mateo pulled out a small canister rigged with a fuse. James said to wedge it somewhere hidden. He spotted a gap between 2 tall wooden crates. Sliding the canister in, he carefully prepared the fuse timer. His hands trembled so badly he feared he'd drop the lighter. But at last, he got it ready, 10 minutes until ignition. A surge of adrenaline shot through him as he realized the point of no return had arrived. He retraced his steps, clinging to the fence. Twice, the guard's flashlight came perilously close, but luck held. He made it back to the dumpster rendezvous, panting. A minute later, James appeared, expression intent. "All set," he mouthed. Mateo nodded. though his heart pounded so loud he feared the guards might hear it. James produced a small remote device. "Let's go. Once we're clear, I'll trigger the spark on my end." They slipped away into the darkness, hugging the perimeter. As they reached a side street, hidden from direct sight, James pressed a button on the remote. A half-minute later, distant pops and sparks erupted behind Gulf Star Freight. Then a roar of flames. Almost immediately, shouts rang out. Orange fire flickered over the rooftops. Mateo's nerves nearly collapsed. He pictured men scrambling inside, dousing flames, crates igniting. He could only pray no innocent workers were caught in the chaos. James tugged him away, urging him to run. They sprinted through back alleys, the glow of the fire reflecting off the night sky. They didn't stop until they reached the pickup parked in a dark lot several blocks away. Sliding behind the wheel, Mateo's hands shook as he started the engine. James glanced out the rear window at the distant flames. "That should keep them busy," he said grimly. "We'll see how Helena responds." In the following days, the sabotage shook the Bay Dogs network. Rumors flew about an unknown militia torching shipments. Some whispered that drug cartels up the coast had declared war on Helena's operation, fueling paranoia. Guards were doubled at certain warehouses, while others were left undermanned. The entire organization seethed with tension. Yet, to Mateo's dismay, no sign of Celia emerged. He prayed that the resulting confusion might force her captors to move her, slip up, or reveal her location. But as days passed, information remained scarce. James, however, insisted they press on. "We've rattled them," he said. "Now we pry open the cracks." Benito came through with a new tip. A fisherman who'd been coerced into ferrying Bay Dog enforcers at night overheard them mention a farmhouse about 20 miles inland, where they kept special cargo. James latched onto that. "We'll check it," he said, eyes gleaming with a feral determination. "We just need a bit more intel." Mateo clung to hope. If the farmhouse was real, maybe Celia was there. Time was slipping away, and every passing moment tore at him. He threw himself into the search with a desperation that bordered on madness. In James, he found a steadying hand, a man honed by war, channeling violence into a calculated plan. Another week passed in a blur of covert reconnaissance. They discovered the likely location of the farmhouse, a secluded property down a dirt road. James tested the perimeter one night, counting 4 armed guards and a barbed wire fence. The house had boarded windows and watchful men smoking on the porch. A single black SUV was parked out front. "It's heavily guarded," James reported back. "Could be the place they keep high-value hostages. We'll confirm tomorrow night. See if Celia's in there." Mateo swallowed. "And if she is?" James's lips pressed into a grim line. "Then we're going in." The final confrontation loomed. The Bay Dogs had no idea that a storm of vengeance was about to crash upon them, led by a Marine raider who'd already lost too much. And if Helena Pierce thought her quiet threats would keep James Barrera at bay, she was about to learn just how deadly a man with nothing left to lose could be. Chapter 11. Blood on the doorstep. Late the next afternoon, Mateo's phone rang. A withheld number. His breath caught, hoping it might be Celia. He answered with shaky eagerness, only to hear Helena Pierce's smooth, cultured voice. "It's been quite a while since we last spoke," she said, tone laced with disdain. "You've been busy." Mateo's heart thumped. She must know about the sabotage. His grip tightened on the phone. "Where's my daughter?" Helena chuckled softly, a chilling sound. "Safe for now, but your little stunts have been disruptive. Did you think I wouldn't notice? The sabotage, the random attacks on our supply lines, it's made me quite cross." Rage shot through him. "You took my child," he snarled. "Yes," Helena said, unrepentant, "because you forced my hand. But I'm a practical woman. I'll make you a deal. Turn yourself in unarmed, to the warehouse on Harbor Road tonight. We'll discuss terms for Celia's release. If you don't show or if you bring any friends, I can't guarantee her safety." Mateo's lungs felt crushed. He recognized it as a trap. But what choice did he have? "I'll come," he rasped, throat tight. "Good. 9 p.m. sharp." She paused. "Oh, and if you're thinking of bringing your Marine brother, don't. I know he's back in town. My men are eager to meet him. But if I see him anywhere near the warehouse, you'll regret it." The line clicked dead. Shakily, Mateo relayed the conversation to James, Benito, and Marisol. They had gathered to plan the final infiltration of the farmhouse that night. But Helena's ultimatum changed everything. Benito cursed under his breath. "She's playing mind games, forcing you to walk into a trap." James's face hardened. "We can't let you go alone. That's suicide." Mateo's voice quavered. "We don't have a choice. She'll kill Celia if I don't show." Dallas rubbed his temples. "Maybe they're keeping Celia at that warehouse, not the farmhouse." James exhaled, frustration mounting. "She might just be using the warehouse as a lure to capture you or me. They could move Celia anywhere." Mateo sank into a chair, head in hands. "I can't not go. If there's any chance she's there, we do it on our terms." James cut in sharply. He paced, eyes blazing. "You'll go, but you'll wear a hidden transmitter. Benito, Marisol, and Dallas will stand by in vehicles near the perimeter. I'll infiltrate from above or from a side entrance, covering you. If Celia's inside, we'll get her out. If it's a trick, we still turn the tables." Mateo stared at the floor. A wave of gratitude and terror washed through him. "All right," he whispered. They hurriedly gathered gear. James produced a small transmitter earpiece and microphone, left over from some private security job. He tested it with a handheld receiver, ensuring the range was decent. Mateo would slip it under his shirt collar. Meanwhile, Benito and Dallas would stand by with rifles in their trucks a few blocks away, ready to storm in if the signal was given. Marisol would monitor the earpiece feed from a vantage point down the street. That evening, dark clouds rolled in, rumbling with distant thunder, an apt backdrop for the confrontation. Mateo arrived at the designated warehouse right at 9, stepping from his truck onto cracked pavement. A single overhead lamp cast harsh shadows on corrugated metal walls. He wore casual clothes, no visible weapons. The transmitter was hidden under his shirt, though, and James lurked somewhere in the darkness. Helena emerged from the warehouse's open door, flanked by 2 armed men. She wore a tailored gray suit, high heels clicking on the concrete. Her face was impassive, eyes reflecting a dangerous light. "Punctual," she said softly. Mateo's voice shook. "Where is she?" Helena's lips curved in a mocking smile. "Inside, but you'll have to prove your sincerity first." One of her men stepped forward, frisking Mateo none too gently. The man patted him down, missing the small transmitter but confiscating his wallet and phone. "He's clean," the guard grunted. Helena gestured for Mateo to enter. Heart pounding, he followed her into the cavernous interior. Dim lights revealed stacks of crates, forklift pallets, and a small office enclosure at the far end. A musty smell of old fish packing lingered in the air. Several more armed gang members stood around, their expressions hostile. Mateo scanned the shadows, hoping to glimpse Celia. Instead, Helena led him to a cleared area near the center, where a single chair stood facing the door. "Sit," she commanded. He hesitated. "Not until I see my daughter," she sighed, snapping her fingers. Another door opened, and Celia was shoved into view by a burly enforcer. Her hands were bound, a strip of duct tape over her mouth, eyes wide with terror. A bruise marred her temple, and her clothes were dirty. Mateo nearly collapsed in relief and anguish. "Celia's alive," He took a step forward, tears brimming, but Helena held up a hand. "That's close enough." She gave a thin smile. "Reunion comes after we settle terms." Mateo forced himself not to rush. "What do you want?" "Simple," Helena replied, circling him. "I want you to confess on camera that you sabotaged our shipments, attacked our people, and incited the Fisherman's rebellion. Then you'll reveal the names of everyone involved, especially your brother. After that, you'll sign over your boat and property, and we might let you and Celia go free, somewhere far from here. That is, if I believe you're sincere." His jaw clenched. He realized that if he complied, he'd be condemning Benito, Dallas, Marisol, everyone. "You can't be serious. That'd just make it easier for you to pick them off, too." Her eyes flashed with annoyance. "This port is ours now. Cooperate or your daughter pays the price." She snapped her fingers again. The burly enforcer holding Celia prodded her with a gun. She whimpered, tears streaking her face. Rage and desperation warred within Mateo. He heard James's distant voice in the earpiece, a faint whisper no one else could pick up. "Hang in there. I see you. Stand by." Mateo swallowed, stalling. "Fine. Let me see her up close first. Make sure she's okay." Helena shook her head. "No, I'm not that foolish." She pointed at the chair. "Sit." He sank down, trembling. Helena nodded to one of her men, who produced a handheld camera. A word to life, the red light blinking. Another guard pressed a piece of paper into Mateo's shaking hands. "Read this," Helena ordered. Word for word. Mateo glanced at the text, which was a full confession. "I, Mateo Barrera, admit to conspiring against the legitimate port authority." He nearly choked on the hypocrisy, but Celia's tear-filled eyes drove him on. Slowly, he began to read. Each word felt like a dagger to his integrity and a betrayal of the people who risked themselves to help him. Helena watched with a cold smirk. Once he finished, her expression tightened. "Now, name your accomplices." Mateo faltered. "I." James's voice whispered in the earpiece again. "Give them some names. Fake it. We're almost in position." With a flush of relief, Mateo realized James was about to strike. He stared at Helena. "Benito Salazar," he said slowly, praying Benito was safe outside. "Dallas Martinez, Marisol Reyes, all of them helped me." He forced out the words, sounding convincing. Helena nodded, satisfied. "Good. Very good. Now the fishermen will think you sold them out. Your credibility is gone. That's one less rebel to worry about." She flicked a hand, and Celia was pushed forward. "You might just live through this, Fisherman." Mateo watched his daughter stumble, sobbing behind the duct tape, his fists curled. "Now, James, now." On cue, a feint were echoed in the rafters above. One of Helena's men looked up. A dark figure dropped from a ceiling beam, boots hitting the floor with a resounding thud. James, clad in black. In a single fluid motion, he fired a silenced pistol, taking out the nearest guard with a suppressed pop. Another guard spun, but James was faster, slamming him with a baton strike that sent him sprawling. Helena's eyes flared with shock. "Shoot him!" she screamed. Gunfire erupted in the warehouse. Mateo dove to the floor, rolling behind a crate. Celia cried out, cowering against a metal support column. James wove among the crates, returning fire with deadly accuracy. A bullet sparked off the concrete near him, but he kept moving, calm and lethal. Mateo scrambled for Celia, ignoring the chaos. A guard tried to block him, leveling a rifle, but a shot rang out from the warehouse entrance. Benito, Dallas, and Marisol burst in, guns blazing. The guard fell, struck in the shoulder. In the confusion, Mateo reached Celia, ripping the tape from her mouth. She sobbed, collapsing into his arms. He cut her bindings with a pocket knife, tears coursing down his cheeks. "I've got you, Mija," he gasped. Helena retreated behind two of her men, fury twisting her features. Another guard raised his weapon at father and daughter. James roared, tackling the guard from behind, snapping the man's neck with ruthless efficiency. Helena seized a nearby pistol and aimed at James. Their eyes locked, a standoff. He dove behind a pillar as she fired, the bullet gouging concrete. Pandemonium reigned. Gunshots echoed, muzzle flashes illuminating swirling dust. Benito and Dallas fired sporadically, forcing Helena's men to take cover. More guards spilled in from side rooms, outnumbering the rescuers. James fought like a demon, weaving and shooting with a methodical brutality. Mateo shielded Celia, trying to protect her from stray bullets. Finally, Helena found herself cornered near a stack of crates, pinned down by James's relentless assault. Her men lay wounded or dead. She glared at James, panting. "You worthless traitor," she spat, voice trembling with rage. "You think you can stop progress with a handful of fishermen and a broken soldier?" James stepped closer, pistol raised. "This is my family," he growled. "You messed with the wrong people." Her lip curled. "Fine," she hissed. "Let's finish it." She whipped her gun up, but James fired first, a single bullet piercing her shoulder. She staggered, a strangled cry escaping her lips. The pistol fell from her hand. She crumpled to her knees, clutching the wound. Mateo hurried over, Celia trembling beside him. The last of Helena's men either lay unconscious or had fled. Benito, Dallas, and Marisol checked the perimeter. Smoke drifted through the warehouse. James stood over Helena, gun barrel aimed at her head. His finger tensed on the trigger, eyes burning with a lethal glint. Mateo put a hand on his brother's arm, heart pounding. "James, no. She can stand trial. We don't have to." James's face twisted with pain and fury. Helena coughed, blood seeping through her elegant suit. She tried to sneer, but all that emerged was a wince of agony. "You'll never be safe," she rasped. "Others will replace me. This port is ours." "You can't." James's fist cracked across her jaw, silencing her. He knelt, rummaging her pockets for a phone or ledger, something that might incriminate the entire network. Then he exhaled, stepping back. "I'm not a murderer unless I have to be," he said thickly, pressing a palm to his temple as though warding off old ghosts. Helena crumpled, unconscious. Lights from outside flashed. Police sirens, alerted by the gunfire. Benito cursed under his breath. "We gotta go. They'll arrest us all." Celia clung to Mateo, sobbing into his shoulder. He held her tight, tears in his own eyes. "You're safe now," he whispered. James assessed the situation. "We can't stay. Help me carry the evidence we can. We'll vanish before the cops fully converge." They grabbed what they could: Helena's phone, the camera that recorded Mateo's forced confession. Then Benito, Dallas, and Marisol hustled out, leaving Helena, her men, and the chaos behind. James guided Mateo and Celia through a side door. Police sirens blared closer. They slipped into the night, hearts racing. Outside, the thunderstorm finally broke. Rain pelted them as they piled into vehicles. Mateo draped a blanket around Celia, who trembled against him. He brushed her hair back, murmuring comforting words. From the driver's seat, James stared ahead, face drawn and haunted. "It's over," he said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. But even as they pulled away from the warehouse, sirens filling the stormy sky, they all knew there would be consequences. The Bay Dogs wouldn't vanish overnight, and Helena's downfall might spark further violence. Yet, for now, the Barrera family was reunited, father, daughter, and the uncle with nothing left to lose. Hope flickered in that battered pickup truck, cradled by the pounding rain. The nightmare wasn't fully ended, but they had broken Helena Pierce's stranglehold. and Celia was free. Chapter 12. Aftermath. They drove for miles through pouring rain, hearts pounding, adrenaline still surging. When they finally stopped, it was at Benito's modest place outside of town, a spot less likely to be associated with the Barreras. Celia, exhausted from fear and captivity, nearly collapsed. Mateo carried her inside, setting her gently on a couch. He watched her with tear-filled eyes, relief coursing through him. After days of agony, he was finally able to hug his daughter, stroking her hair. James stood by the door, scanning the windows as if expecting an attack. Benito offered him a towel and some water, which he accepted mechanically. Blood smeared his knuckles, none of it his own. Despite the victory, his gaze remained distant. News traveled fast. Within an hour, a flurry of phone calls revealed that multiple police cruisers and ambulances had converged on the burning warehouse. Helena Pierce had been found alive but injured, her men either dead or in custody. One rumor claimed she'd be flown out for emergency medical care. Another rumor suggested federal agents might get involved. Once the scale of the Bay Dogs operation was uncovered, for the local fishermen it was a turning point. Without Helena's iron grip, her underlings were scattered. Some had no loyalty to the Bay Dogs beyond a paycheck. The entire extortion racket began collapsing. Freed hostages came forward with stories of kidnappings and demands, fueling a wave of public outrage. Tainted officials scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal, hoping to avoid indictment. In the midst of the shifting sands, Celia slept deeply for nearly a full day. When she awoke, she was still groggy, body sore from abuse, but safe. Mateo was at her side, offering gentle words. She fell into his arms, sobbing as she recounted glimpses of her captivity. Days locked in a barren room, the threat of harm if she screamed. The guards had moved her repeatedly, keeping her blindfolded. She never saw Helena until the final day at the warehouse. "It's over, Mija," Mateo whispered, voice thick. "You're safe now." James hovered in the background, silent. When Celia saw him, she managed a weak smile. "Uncle James," she said softly, "you saved me." He nodded, expression pained. "I'm sorry it took me so long." Tears welled in her eyes again, but she reached out, and he crossed the room, letting her wrap him in a trembling hug. For a moment, the stoic warrior melted, returning the embrace with surprising gentleness. No words were needed, only the quiet acceptance that they were family, bound by blood and sacrifice. In the days that followed, the local sheriff's department was forced to open serious investigations into the Bay Dogs' crimes. State troopers and eventually federal authorities arrived, combing through the rubble of Helena's operation. Her past connections and shady investments were laid bare. Though she was rumored to have survived surgery, Helena would face a slew of charges if she recovered enough to stand trial. Benito helped coordinate efforts to protect any remaining hostages and gather testimonies. Dallas and Marisol gave statements as well, though carefully omitting details of their vigilante roles. People in the community whispered that a mysterious vigilante had toppled Helena's regime, but official reports remained vague. Law enforcement only had scattered evidence of a shootout at the warehouse. Mateo, Celia, and James stayed out of the public eye, holed up in Benito's spare bedroom for nearly a week. During that time, James seemed restless, haunted. He spent hours sitting outside on the porch, smoking cigarettes and staring at the horizon. One evening, Mateo finally joined him, offering a quiet presence. "You're not staying, are you?" Mateo asked softly, as the sun dipped below the gulf's edge. James exhaled smoke, eyes on the darkening sky. "No, I've never been able to stay anywhere long since." He left the sentence unfinished. War had left its scars on him, both visible and invisible. Mateo rested a hand on his brother's shoulder. "I owe you everything," You brought her back. James tensed. You don't owe me. I did what was right. What I should have done a long time ago. He crushed the cigarette beneath his boot, standing. But I can't be part of this place anymore. Too many ghosts. Soft footsteps sounded behind them. Celia approached, hugging her arms. Uncle James, she murmured. You're leaving. He turned, nodding, unable to meet her eyes. I'm sorry. I'm not cut out for a normal life. I was never good at that, even before all this. Her eyes shone with unshed tears. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. He gently brushed a hand over her hair. For a moment, the old James, the protective brother and uncle, flickered in his gaze. Then he forced a small, sad smile. Stay safe, kiddo. Days later, the crisis finally reached a resolution of sorts. Helena Pierce was flown to a larger hospital under police guard. The bay dogs fractured. Some remnants tried to regroup, but the authorities, emboldened by federal oversight, cracked down with surprising vigor, perhaps looking to save face for ignoring the extortion too long. The local fishermen began to breathe easier. Benito started planning a community festival to raise funds for those who'd been victimized. Dallas returned to repairing his vandalized boat. Marisol reopened her crab line. Life began a slow return to something like normal. The morning James departed, Celia and Mateo stood by Benito's curb, watching him load a worn duffel onto the back of his motorcycle. He wore a patched leather jacket, hair tied back. The silence felt heavy with unspoken farewells. Mateo swallowed hard. Hermano, he said, if you ever need anything. James nodded. Same. He glanced at Celia, who stepped forward. She offered him a small seashell necklace she'd made, the kind she used to craft as a hobby. So you remember home, she said quietly, and that you have people who care about you. For a moment, emotion flickered across James's features. He took the necklace gently, slipping it into his jacket pocket. Thank you, Celia. Then he swung onto the motorcycle. The engine growled to life, echoing across the still recovering neighborhood. Without further words, James revved the throttle and pulled away, disappearing down the old coastal highway. Celia's gaze followed him until he was out of sight. Mateo squeezed her shoulder. He'll find his way, he murmured. She nodded, tears threatening. He already did. For a little while, father and daughter stood there, letting the salty breeze wash over them. Though the cost had been tremendous, they were free from the bay dogs. Celia's bruises would heal, and her spirit would endure. Mateo silently vowed to cherish every moment with her, never again underestimating the fragility of peace. Life on the Gulf Coast port would never be quite the same. The scars left by Helena Pierce's ruthless regime lingered, and new threats might one day arise. But for now, the community stood a bit taller, reminded of what they could endure and what it meant to stand together. James Barrera's shadow loomed large, an unspoken legend among the fishermen. They knew he'd come back if duty ever called him again. A marine raider with nothing left to lose could accomplish the impossible. But maybe, just maybe, one day he'd find his own peace, too. Epilogue. The tide rolls on. The day broke clear and warm a few weeks after Helena's downfall. Mateo Barrera woke early, as always, to check his fishing boat. The sense of dread that had weighed on him for months was gone, replaced by cautious optimism. He navigated the newly freed marina, greeting fellow fishermen who were finally operating without fear of extortion. A battered sign reading "No Bay Dogs Allowed" hung near the dock, half as a joke, half as a reminder of hard-earned triumph. Celia stood at the bow of the boat, stretching her arms to the morning sun. Her bruises faded. She wore a determined grin, like someone who had survived a nightmare and was ready to face the future. A future in which she'd carry the memory of what she'd endured, but never be defined by it. They set out on the water together, father and daughter, feeling the wind whip through their hair. The ocean glittered, unburdened by the shadows that once clouded their daily lives. It wasn't perfect. Money was still tight, and some nightmares lingered, but they had each other. That was enough. As they sailed past the breakwater, Celia reached into her pocket and withdrew a small seashell, similar to the one she'd given Uncle James. She ran her thumb over its ridges, gazing at the horizon. "I wonder if he's okay," she murmured. Mateo put a hand on her shoulder. "Wherever he is, he knows he has a home here." She nodded, a soft smile touching her lips. Then she tucked the shell away. The engine hummed, the boat cutting through gentle swells. They had a day of fishing ahead, and for the first time in what felt like ages, they could cast their nets without glancing over their shoulders. Far away, on a lonely highway, a lone motorcycle carried James Barrera toward the next stretch of unknown. In his jacket pocket lay Celia's shell necklace, a silent promise that he wasn't as alone as he once believed. Memories of war and the ghosts of lost friends would never fully fade. But perhaps, for the first time, James had found a piece of closure. And back on the Gulf Coast, the tide rolled on, whispering of second chances and quiet resilience. The Barrera family had weathered the storm, and though scars remained, they learned that love was stronger than any chain. In the end, the Bay Dogs learned a brutal lesson. When you threaten the innocent and cross the wrong family, you awaken a force far more potent than greed, a relentless will to protect what truly matters at any cost. ND